Dale Pruitt didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed through the kitchen door that Tuesday morning, like he owned every board of it, which in his mind he supposed he did. Eleanor had her back to him, stirring a pot of oatmeal, and she heard his boots before she heard his voice heavy, deliberate, the walk of a man who had decided something before he arrived. Step away from that stove, she turned. He was standing in the center of her kitchen with his arms crossed, and behind him, crowding the doorway, were 3 ranch hands who had no business being there at that hour. They weren't there to eat. They were there to watch. "There's a boy," Dale said, "who tells me you fed him this morning." Sat him down at this table. Gave him bread, coffee. He let the words sit in the air like an accusation at a trial. "That true?" Eleanor set down her spoon. He was hungry. "I didn't ask you why. I asked you if it was true." "Yes." Dale nodded slowly, the way men do when they've already made their decision and are simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. He walked to the wall where the ranch rules were posted, a yellowed sheet of paper that Gerald Holt had nailed up 3 years ago, and he tapped it twice with one finger. "No feeding strangers without authorization." "You read that sign every day for 3 years, Eleanor." "Every single day." "I did, and you broke it anyway." "I did." Something shifted in Dale's expression then. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and more dangerous than anger, the satisfaction of a man who had been looking for a reason and had finally found one. "Pack your things out of here," he said. "You're done in this kitchen. I'm moving you to the shed out back." Eleanor looked at him. She looked at the 3 men in the doorway who were staring at the floor. She looked at the pot of oatmeal, still steaming on the stove, enough to feed 14 men their breakfast. She did not cry. She did not argue. She picked up her spoon, turned back to the stove, and finished stirring. "I'll move after breakfast is served," she said. "These men need to eat." Dale stared at her back for a long moment, then he left, and the men in the doorway, after a second, stepped aside and let him go. If you've ever been punished for doing the right thing, stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next, and hit that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far Eleanor's story has traveled. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Eleanor Whitaker had come to Black River Ranch in the spring of 1881, 3 years before the morning Dale Pruitt tried to erase her. She had arrived by wagon with a single trunk, a cast-iron skillet that had belonged to her mother, and a Recipiconti notebook so worn at the spine that it had to be held together with a piece of twine. The ranch foreman at the time, a sunburned man named Colton, who had since moved on to a spread in Nebraska, had looked her over the way you'd look at a horse you weren't sure about buying. "You ever cooked for 20 men?" he'd asked. 30, she'd said. "Cattle drive. 3 months. Nobody starved and nobody complained twice." Colton had hired her on the spot. What Eleanor had not told him, because he hadn't asked, and she saw no reason to volunteer it, was that she had spent the 2 years before arriving at Black River in something close to ruin. Her husband, James Whitaker, had died in the winter of 1879, a horse accident, quick and senseless, the kind of death that doesn't leave room for preparation. James had been 41 years old. Eleanor had been 39. They had no children. They had a small house in eastern Kansas, a modest savings that lasted 14 months, and then nothing. She had worked where she could after that. A boarding house in Abilene for 7 months. A hotel kitchen in Dodge City for 4. She was good at the work. She had always been good at the work, but she was also a widow in her 40s, with no family connections and no husband's name to shelter behind. And the frontier was not particularly gentle about those facts. Black River Ranch had been a steady thing, steadier than anything she'd had in a long time. 22 cowboys rotating through, a bunkhouse that held 14, a main house where Gerald Holt lived with his wife Catherine and their 2 grown sons. Eleanor fed them all. Breakfast at 5:30. Dinner at noon. Supper at 6. 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Time off at Christmas, because Catherine Holt insisted on cooking that day. Herself and Eleanor had learned not to argue with Catherine Holt about anything that mattered to her. Cowboys had given her a difficult time in the beginning. Not cruelly, or not most of them, but in the thoughtless way men sometimes do when they don't know what to make of a woman who doesn't fit the shapes they're used to. Eleanor was not small. She was not particularly pretty by the standards that got commented on in that era. She was broad-shouldered, plain-faced, with hands that showed years of work and a way of moving through a kitchen that left no wasted motion. Some of the younger cowboys had made remarks about her weight, about her age. about the fact that she never smiled at them the way they seemed to think she ought to. She had never responded to any of it, not because she was a saint, not because it didn't land somewhere, but because she had decided, years before Black River, that she was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her flinch. Instead, she had cooked, and her food had its own argument to make. By the end of the first month, the remarks had stopped. Not because the Cowboys had become better men overnight, but because Eleanor's biscuits were the best thing most of them had ever put in their mouths, and her beef stew on cold nights had a way of making a man feel like the world was survivable. And you don't mock the person who does that for you. You find eventually that you have no interest in it. Dale Pruitt had arrived at Black River 8 months after Eleanor. He came with a reputation as a capable supervisor, organized, efficient, good at managing inventory and men. Gerald Holt had been looking to take a step back from the day-to-day running of the ranch, and Dale had seemed like the answer to that problem. Eleanor had recognized something off about him in the first week, but she had also recognized that it wasn't her place to say so. She had no standing to judge a man's character to his employer. She was the cook. She stayed in her lane. What she had observed, quietly and without comment, was this. Dale Pruitt was the kind of man who needed to be the largest thing in any room he walked into. Not the smartest, not the hardest working, just the largest, the most important, the most deferred to, the one whose mood set the temperature for everyone else. He ran the ranch hands with a short leash and a long memory for any slight real or imagined. Kept a mental ledger of who had challenged him, who had questioned him, who had looked at him sideways, and he collected on those debts in his own time. He had never, in 8 months, spoken to Eleanor as anything other than the help. Suited her fine. She preferred invisible to scrutinized, and she had managed, in a way that required careful daily maintenance, to be largely invisible to Dale Pruitt, until the morning of the boy. The boy had appeared at the kitchen door sometime around 4:30 in the morning, before Eleanor had even gotten the fire started under the first pot. She had heard a sound, not a knock exactly, more like something brushing against the wood, and when she opened the door she had found him standing there, in the gray pre-dawn dark. He was 11, maybe 12. It was hard to say. He was the kind of thin that comes from not enough food over a long enough period of time that your body starts to reorganize itself around the absence. His clothes were wrong for the season, a summer shirt in what was already a cool October, and he had no jacket, no bag, nothing that suggested he had come from anywhere with the intention of going somewhere specific. He just stood there looking at her with the particular expression of a child who has learned that asking for things leads nowhere good. Eleanor had stood in the doorway for maybe 4 seconds. "You hungry?" she said. He didn't answer, but his eyes moved to the kitchen behind her, and that was answer enough. "Come in," she said. "Sit down." She did not ask his name. She did not ask where he had come from, or where he was going, or whether he had parents somewhere who were looking for him. She put oatmeal on the stove, cut bread from the loaf she'd been planning to use for breakfast, and made coffee that was perhaps stronger than an 11-year-old strictly needed, but which he accepted with both hands wrapped around the cup, as though it were keeping him warm from the inside. He ate. He ate the way hungry children eat when they've been hungry long enough, not frantically, but steadily, with a kind of focused attention that left no room for anything else. Eleanor moved around the kitchen, beginning her morning preparations, and did not watch him too closely, because she understood that being watched, while you're that hungry, is its own kind of shame. When he was done, he sat for a moment with his hands still around the empty cup. "Thank you," he said. His voice was quieter than she expected. "You're welcome," she said. "There's more bread if you want it." He took one more piece. Then he stood up, nodded at her in a way that was oddly formal for a child, and walked out the door into the early morning light. She had watched him go, then turned back to her stove. She had known, even in that moment, what she had done. She had not been unaware of the rule. She had read the rule. She had thought about the rule. In the 4 seconds she'd stood in the doorway, and she had decided that the rule was wrong. Not wrong in principle. Necessarily she understood why Gerald Holt didn't want his kitchen turned into a way station for every passing stranger. Resources were finite. The ranch was a business. Rules existed for reasons. But there was a child. There was a hungry child standing in the dark in an October that was getting colder every morning, wearing a summer shirt with that expression on his face, and Eleanor Whitaker had decided in 4 seconds that she was not the kind of person who was going to close the door. Whatever came after that, she was not going to close the door. What came after was Dale Pruitt, roughly 2 hours later, stepping into her kitchen with 3 men at his back and that look on his face. The days immediately following her removal from the main kitchen were by any measure the worst stretch Eleanor had experienced since James died. Not because of the shed itself, the shed was bad, but it was a physical problem, and physical problems she knew how to work with. It was the other thing, the exposure of it. Being walked out of the main kitchen while the ranch hands watched, carrying her cast iron skillet and her recipe notebook and her small box of personal items across the yard to a building that had last been used to store broken equipment. She was aware with precision of every person who watched and said nothing. She was aware, with equal precision, of Emmett Hayes, who had been standing near the water pump when it happened, and who had looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, not pity exactly, but something more complicated than pity. Emmett was 34, lean and dark-haired, a ranch hand who had been at Black River for almost 2 years. He was not the kind of man who talked much. He did his work and did it well and kept himself mostly to himself, which Eleanor had always respected. He hadn't said anything that morning, but he hadn't looked away either. The shed was 16 feet by 12 feet. Stove inside it, an old cast iron range that had been replaced in the main kitchen 2 years ago, worked after a fashion, meaning that if you coaxed it correctly and didn't ask too much of it, it would maintain a fire. The roof had 2 places where the boards had warped badly enough that rain would come through, which meant Eleanor spent her first night in the shed, lying on her cot, listening to the sound of the sky and calculating which way she would need to move if the weather turned. The shelves were empty except for a rusted coffee tin and a mouse nest in the corner that Eleanor removed without ceremony first thing in the morning. She took stock. She had her skillet, her notebook, the box of personal items which included a small amount of her own money she'd saved over 3 years, a change of clothes, and the particular stubbornness that had carried her through worse situations than this one. She did not have an operational kitchen, supplies, a mandate from anyone to do anything. She sat on the edge of her cot that first night, and she did not allow herself to think about James, because thinking about James when things were at their worst had a way of pulling her under, and she could not afford to be pulled under right now. She thought instead about the boy, the particular way he had sat at her table with his hands around the coffee cup, the formal nod when he left. She had no idea who he was. She had no idea if he was safe wherever he had gone. She had no idea if she would ever see him again. But she had done the right thing. She held on to that, through the dark of the first night in the shed, and it was enough. Not comfortable, not warm, not even entirely consoling, but enough she was up before dawn. She built a fire in the old stove. It took 4 tries, which were 2 more than she would have liked, but 2 fewer than she'd been afraid of, and she assessed what she had available and what she could reasonably acquire without money she couldn't afford to spend. There was a kitchen garden behind the main house that Catherine Holt maintained herself. Eleanor had spent 3 years tending part of it, the herb section, and Catherine had, in a quiet conversation the afternoon after Eleanor's removal, pressed a key into her hand without a word of explanation. Key was for the garden gate. Catherine Holt did not say anything about it because Catherine Holt had reached that particular stage of marriage where she understood that some things were better managed without involving her husband. Eleanor used the key. She also, on the second day, approached the 3 ranch hands she knew best, not friends exactly, but men she had fed well for 3 years and who she judged, carefully, to have more conscience than most, and asked them plainly if any of them were willing to help her repair the shed stove properly and patch the worst of the roof. Dale finds out. One of them said, "He'll make it bad for us." He might, Eleanor agreed. That's a fair concern. "What do you need?" she told them. 2 came that evening. Emmett Hayes was one of them. They worked for 3 hours by lantern light. Nobody spoke much. There was something about the work itself that made talking feel beside the point. By the end of the 3rd day, the stove drew clean, the worst of the roof was patched, and Eleanor had a functional kitchen in a building that 12 days ago had been storing broken fence posts. She made biscuits. She made them the same way she had made them every morning for 3 years, lard cut into flour, cold water added slow, hands that knew by feel when the dough was right. She baked 2 dozen. She put 12 of them in a cloth on the bench outside the shed. She did not announce them. She did not put up a sign. She simply left them there and went back inside to work on dinner. The biscuits were gone within 40 minutes. The day after that, a ranch hand she barely knew knocked on the shed door at mid-morning and asked if she had anything left over from breakfast. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make you something." He sat. He ate. Before he left, he looked around at the shed, the repaired stove, the shelves Eleanor had cleaned and begun to fill, the way she had organized the small space into something functional, and he shook his head slowly. "How'd you do all this?" he said. "One problem at a time," she said. He came back the next day. He brought 2 other men with him. Eleanor noticed something happening over those first weeks in the shed that she hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite name. The men who came to eat, and there were more of them each day, often men who had perfectly adequate food available to them in the main bunkhouse, did not come only for the food. Or rather, they came for the food, but something kept them there a little longer than the food strictly required. There was a quality to the shed that the main kitchen had never quite had. The main kitchen was functional, efficient, organized. It was a place where meals were produced on schedule and consumed in rotation, and that was that. The sheds was smaller, which meant the people who ate in it sat closer together, which meant conversations happened that wouldn't have happened at the long bunkhouse tables. And Eleanor, unbound from the rigid schedule and the watchful presence of Dale Pruitt, cooked differently in the shed. She cooked the way she had cooked in the years before Black River, when she had fed people in harder circumstances, and had understood that a meal was not just fuel. It was sometimes the only warmth a person was going to get that day. She had stopped charging people, or rather, she had never charged people in the shed, which became clear very quickly, was going to be a problem for her financially, and which she was going to have to find a solution for. But in the meantime, she fed people, and one evening, a cowboy who had traveled through 3 territories and had nowhere much to be pulled a worn piece of paper out of his shirt pocket and put it on her table. "My mother's recipe for corn chowder," he said, "from Tennessee. You can have it if you want it." Eleanor looked at the paper. She looked at the man. He was perhaps 30 years old and had the eyes of someone who had been moving for a long time. She opened her recipe notebook and found a blank page near the back. "Write it in here," she said. He did. He wrote it in careful handwriting, and below the recipe, without being asked, he wrote his name and where he was from. Eleanor looked at it after he left. She looked at the pages before it, her husband James's handwriting on a few of the older recipes, her own handwriting on most of them, and now this stranger's careful letters at the back. She wasn't sure why it mattered, but it did. She began quietly and without making an announcement of it, to ask people to leave something in the notebook if they were willing. Not a payment, not a trade. Just, if you have a recipe you want to keep alive, or a name you want written somewhere, write it here. Some people didn't. That was fine. Some people wrote recipes. Some wrote names. One woman, a settler's wife who had come in with 3 children during a bad week in November when her husband was sick, and she had nothing left in the house, wrote 3 lines from a song she said her grandmother used to sing, because she couldn't think of a recipe and she wanted to leave something. Eleanor told her that was exactly right. The notebook was filling up, and the people of the Kansas frontier, who had been scattered by distance and hardship and the sheer grinding difficulty of the life they had chosen or had been born into, were finding, in Eleanor's shed, something they hadn't expected to find at the back of a failing ranch's unused property, a place that felt like someone was paying attention. Successful things attract attention of all kinds, and by the time December arrived and the shed was drawing a steady stream of visitors on most days, Eleanor was aware of a change in Dale Pruitt's attitude toward her. He had expected her to fail quietly. He had expected her to make do inadequately for a few weeks, and then come back, somehow diminished, and take whatever smaller position he was willing to offer her. That was how he imagined the story going. It wasn't going that way. And Dale Pruitt, who kept careful ledgers of challenges to his authority, had begun to notice. Eleanor first understood the nature of the new threat on a cold morning in early December when one of the younger ranch hands, a boy of about 19 named Clem, came to find her with a look on his face that she had learned to read as bad news being delivered reluctantly. "Dale's been talking to Holt," Clem said. "About the shed." "What about it?" Clem shifted his weight. "About how you're using ranch property, without authorization. How you're pulling workers away from their duties to eat over here. How he stopped. He's got a whole speech about it. I heard some of it." Eleanor looked at the notebook sitting on her shelf. Then she looked at the stove, which was running clean and warm, and had been doing so for 6 weeks. "When?" she said. "Don't know for certain. Soon, I think." She thanked Clem, and he left, and Eleanor stood in her shed for a moment, with the particular of someone who has known something was coming and has still not finished preparing for it. She thought about Gerald Holt, a man she had always found fair, or at least fairer than most. She thought about what Dale would say to him and what Dale would not say. Thought about the notebook. Then she did what she always did when she needed to think clearly. She started cooking. She was making a venison stew tough meat that had come from a hunter who had stopped by 2 days ago and left in exchange for a meal and the permission to write his daughter's name in the notebook when Emmett Hayes came through the door without knocking, which was unusual for him. "You hear," he said. "Clem told me." Emmett sat down at her small table. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that was characteristic of him, not uncomfortable silence, just the silence of someone who was assembling his words into the right order. "He's going to say, you're operating outside your employment," Emmett said. "That the shed was given to you as a reassignment, not as a—" He gestured around him, searching for the word. "Enterprise," Eleanor said. Yeah, he looked at her. "He's not wrong about the letter of it." "I know. But he's wrong about everything else," Eleanor said. "Yes." Emmett was quiet again. The stew was beginning to smell like something worth waiting for. Outside, the Kansas cold was sitting against the shed walls, and inside the fire in the old stove was doing what it had been doing for 6 weeks, which was holding. "What are you going to do?" Emmett said. Eleanor thought about the boy, the summer shirt, the formal nod. "Same thing I've been doing," she said. "Cook?" Emmett looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, in a way that reminded her not painfully, just factually, of the way James used to nod when she said something he agreed with completely, but had no words to add to. "All right," he said. "Then I'm here." Outside, December was settling its weight across the Kansas prairie, and somewhere down the road, probably in a warm office or at a firelit table, Dale Pruitt was making his plans. Eleanor Whitaker stirred her stew, adjusted the heat under the pot, and did not let herself feel afraid. She had built this place once already from nothing, in the cold and the dark with her own hands. Whatever came next, she knew how to build. The stew was still warm when Dale Pruitt came the first time. Not to the shed, not yet. He was smarter than that, or at least more careful. He sent Clem back with a message, written on a folded piece of paper in Dale's tight, precise handwriting, informing Eleanor that the use of ranch firewood was to be logged and accounted for through the main supply office beginning immediately, and that any food preparation occurring on ranch property outside the main kitchen required written authorization from the ranch supervisor. Eleanor read the note twice, then she folded it and put it in the pocket of her apron. She knew what it was. It wasn't about firewood. It was about making the shed impossible to operate through accumulated friction, a rule here, a requirement there, each one reasonable sounding in isolation, each one designed to make Eleanor's mornings start with bureaucracy instead of cooking. A woman who had to spend her first hour of every day managing paperwork and permission requests was a woman who couldn't spend that hour feeding people. Dale had always been better at administration than he was at people. That was his particular kind of intelligence, and Eleanor had always respected it the way you respect a thing that could hurt you. She wrote back, carefully, without emotion, in her own handwriting on the back of his note. She estimated the amount of firewood used per week, offered to pay for it from her own income, and requested that he send her the authorization form so she could fill it out properly. She thanked him for his attention to ranch resources. She handed the folded paper back to Clem and told him to enjoy the last of the biscuits before they went cold. The authorization form never came. Neither did any further notes that week. Eleanor understood this too if he sent the form. He was acknowledging that her operation in the shed was a legitimate thing that could be authorized. The absence of the form was a different kind of trap. Without authorization, she was technically operating outside her remit. With the form pending, she was in a gray space that he could collapse on her at any moment of his choosing. She kept cooking. December deepened. The Kansas cold settled in the way it does, out there, not dramatically, not with blizzards, just a slow lowering of the world's temperature, until the air itself felt like something you had to push through. The shed, which had no insulation worthy of the name, held warmth, only because Eleanor kept the stove going from before dawn to after dark, and because whoever was sitting at her table on any given evening generated enough body heat to matter. There were almost always people at the table now. The formula had developed organically, without Eleanor planning it. Breakfast was for whoever was up early and wanted something better than what the bunkhouse cook offered, which was not saying much since the bunkhouse cook was a reasonable man named Warren, who simply didn't have Eleanor's 30 years of practice. Dinner, the midday meal, drew a small rotating crowd of ranch hands. Plus, increasingly, travelers who had heard about the shed from someone they'd met on the road and had made a small detour to find it. Supper was quieter, But it was the meal that lasted longest because by evening the work was done and people had time to sit. It was at supper on a Tuesday in the second week of December that Eleanor first met the Harmon family. They came in three: a man, a woman, and a girl of about 8, with the particular stunned look of people who have been in a wagon for too many consecutive days and have stopped being able to feel parts of themselves. The man, whose name was Robert Harmon, explained that they were heading west toward Colorado territory, that their wagon had thrown a wheel 2 miles back, that the wheel was repaired now, but the repair had taken most of their remaining money, and that they had not eaten since the previous morning. Eleanor looked at the girl, who was standing very still beside her mother with her arms wrapped around herself and her eyes moving around the shed in the way children's eyes do when they are trying to understand a new place. "Sit down," Eleanor said. All of you, she fed them. It was a Tuesday, so she had the last of a venison roast and a pot of beans that had been simmering since morning, and she gave them each as much as they could eat, which for Robert Harmon was 3 full plates and an expression that had started blank, and arrived by the 3rd plate, somewhere in the territory of stunned gratitude. When they were done, the wife Martha offered to pay with the small amount of coin she had left. Eleanor shook her head. "Keep that," she said. "You'll need it in Colorado." Martha Harmon looked at her with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite catalog. Not just grateful, something more complicated. The expression of a woman who had been told, perhaps many times, that nothing was ever truly given, and who was encountering evidence to the contrary and didn't entirely know what to do with it. "Why?" Martha said, not rudely, just honestly. Eleanor thought about it for a moment. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. "Because somebody did it for me once," she said. "Long time ago." She paused. "And because your daughter looks cold." Before they left, Martha Harmon asked quietly, while Robert was settling the girl's coat, if she could write something in the notebook. Eleanor opened it to the next blank page and handed her a pencil. Martha wrote a recipe for sweet potato pudding. Below it she wrote Robert, Martha, and Clara Harmon, December 1884, on the way to Colorado. "The woman in the shed fed us when we had nothing left. We won't forget." Eleanor read it after they left. She stood in the empty shed with the notebook open in her hands, and the stove ticking as it cooled slightly in the quiet, and she read it 3 times. Then she put the notebook on the shelf and went to bank the fire for the night. She slept better that night than she had in 2 weeks. The morning arrived, as mornings had a way of doing, with its own complications. Emmett was at her door before 5 o'clock, not unusual. He had taken to helping her with the morning fires since the first week, but the look on his face when she opened the door was the look of someone who has news and is uncertain how to begin it. "Dale talked to Holt last night," Emmett said, stepping inside. Eleanor moved to the stove and began building the fire. "How do you know?" "Patterson was in the main house fixing a shutter. Heard most of it." Eleanor didn't ask who Patterson had told, because it didn't matter. On a ranch, everything moved through the air, eventually. "What did he say?" Emmett sat down at the table. He put his hat on the surface in front of him and turned it in his hands. His tell, Eleanor had noticed, for when he was working out how to say something he thought was going to upset her. "He told Holt you've turned the shed into a public eating house, that you're drawing outsiders onto the property, that you spent money on supplies without authorization." A pause. "Told Holt you were doing it for profit." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, tending the fire. "Holt believe him?" "Don't know," Patterson said. Holt listened. "Didn't say much," asked Dale if he had documentation. "And does he?" "Not yet." Emmett set his hat flat on the table. "But he's looking." Eleanor understood the geometry of this. Dale didn't need to prove anything specific. He only needed to create enough uncertainty in Gerald Holt's mind that Holt would feel obligated to intervene. A ranch owner who heard that a displaced cook was running a profitable enterprise on his property, potentially creating legal liability, potentially attracting the wrong kind of attention, that ranch owner had legitimate reasons to act. The fact that Eleanor was not profiting, that she was operating on nothing, and giving away what little she had, was a truth that required context to understand, and context was the first casualty of a well-constructed accusation. "I need to talk to Holt myself," Eleanor said. "He's in Wichita until Friday." Closed the door of the stove. The fire was catching. "Then I have until Friday," she said. The next 3 days were the kind that Eleanor would remember later, not for any single event, but for the texture of them, the feeling of living inside a situation that was building towards something while also continuing stubbornly to be a series of ordinary moments. Cooked. People came, the notebook filled. Emmett came at dawn and sometimes stayed until mid-morning. Clem drifted in and out with the nervous energy of a young man who has discovered that the adult world involves more moral ambiguity than he was prepared for. On Thursday evening, a woman came alone. She was perhaps 60, traveling in a buckboard wagon with a mule that had seen better years, and she sat at Eleanor's table and ate a bowl of soup with the careful precision of someone who has forgotten, or never learned, how to accept kindness without looking for the catch. Her name was Agnes Birch. She had been a seamstress in Missouri, she said, until her hands had gone bad arthritis that had taken the fine motor work from her and left her with hands that could do most things, but not the delicate things, not the things that had been her livelihood. She was going east to stay with a cousin she hadn't seen in 12 years and wasn't entirely sure still wanted her. 12 years, Eleanor said. That's a long time to lose track of someone. My husband and her husband didn't get along, Agnes said. She said it simply, without apology or explanation, the way people say things that are complicated but finished. My husband's been gone 4 years now. Mine too, Eleanor said. 5. Agnes looked at her across the table. You manage? Most days. Eleanor refilled the soup bowl without being asked. Some days you just get through. Agnes nodded. She looked at the notebook which was sitting on its shelf. What's that? Eleanor told her. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Can I write something in it, even if I don't have a recipe? Yes, Agnes wrote. Eleanor did not read it until later, after Agnes had gone to sleep in the buckboard and Eleanor was banking the fire for the night. Agnes had written, I was a seamstress. My hands don't work the same anymore. I don't know what I am now, but tonight I was warm. Eleanor stood in the quiet shed for a long time. She understood, in a way she hadn't been able to articulate before, what the notebook was becoming. It wasn't a recipe collection. It wasn't a guest register. It was something harder to name, a record of people who had been in motion, who had been uncertain, who had arrived somewhere cold and tired and had found 15 square feet of repaired shed and an old stove and a woman who asked no questions, a moment of being still. That was what she was building. Not a kitchen, not a business. A moment of stillness in a life that didn't offer many. Dale Pruitt could not see it because Dale Pruitt had never needed it. Gerald Holt returned from Wichita on Friday morning, and Eleanor was at the main house by 9 o'clock. She had not asked for an appointment. She had simply gone to the front door and knocked, and when Catherine Holt answered, Eleanor had said, I need 15 minutes with your husband if he has them. Catherine had looked at her for a moment, then stepped aside, and that had been that. Gerald Holt was 56, heavy-set, with a white mustache, and the permanently squinted expression of a man who spent a lot of his life outdoors reading weather. He was not unkind. Eleanor had always found him essentially decent, which was not the same as finding him particularly perceptive, but decent was a starting point. He was sitting at his desk when she came in. He looked up, and there was something in his expression, a faint discomfort, that told her Dale had been there before her. Mrs. Whitaker, he said. Mr. Holt. She sat down without being invited, because this was not a morning for waiting to be invited. I want to tell you what I'm doing in that shed, so you're hearing it from me. He waited. She told him. Not everything she didn't tell him about the Harmon family, or Agnes Birch, or the man from Tennessee with his mother's corn chowder recipe, because those were not points in a legal argument. They were the whole point, and she wasn't sure Gerald Holt was ready for the whole point. She told him the practical things, that she was using a small amount of firewood, that she was prepared to pay for. She was not charging anyone for food, that she was not running a business, and had no intention of doing so. People who came to the shed were not causing any disruption to ranch operations, and in fact several of the ranch hands ate there, in addition to, not instead of, their regular meals. Holt listened. He was a man who actually listened, which Eleanor had always respected about him. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Dale tells me you're creating liability, he said. Someone gets sick. Someone gets hurt on the property. Becomes my problem. That's a fair concern, Eleanor said. It's also a concern about something that hasn't happened. But could a lot of things. She kept her voice level. The shed was sitting empty, collecting rot when I moved into it. Cleaner now, and more structurally sound than it's been in years. The stove that was rusting is running properly. I am not asking you for anything, Mr. Holt. I'm not asking for supplies or salary or recognition. I'm telling you what I'm doing so you hear it plainly. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Dale says you broke the rule about feeding strangers. I did, and you'd do it again, I would. He exhaled through his nose. That's not a defense, Mrs. Whitaker. No, she agreed. It's not. But it's the truth, and I thought you deserved that more than a defense. Something shifted in Gerald Holt's expression. Not enough to call it a turning point, not yet. But something. He picked up a pen and set it down again, the gesture of a man who is thinking rather than writing. I'm not going to shut you down, he said finally. Not today. But I need Dale settled, and I need you to stay inside the lines. Document your firewood use. Keep a record of who comes and goes. If anything breaks or anyone gets hurt, you come to me immediately. He paused. And I want this to be clear, you are not, in any formal sense, operating a business on my property. Understood. All right. He looked back at his desk, which was the signal that the conversation was over. Then he looked back up. Mrs. Whitaker. Yes, the boy. The one you fed. He was quiet for a moment. Anyone find out who he was? No, Eleanor said. I don't know where he went. Holt nodded slowly. I'm not sure Dale was wrong about the rule, he said. But I'm not sure I'd have closed the door either. Eleanor stood, nodded, and left. She walked back across the yard to the shed, with the cold air moving across the back of her neck, and the awareness crisp and useful that she had bought herself time but not safety. Dale Pruitt would not be stopped by Gerald Holt's mild neutrality. He would regroup. He would find another angle. He was already finding it, as it turned out. Emmett brought her the information that same evening, pieced together from 3 separate conversations he'd had with men who worked around the main house. Dale had contacted 2 men investors, or something close to it. Men with money who moved between ranches in the territory looking for opportunities, and had represented Eleanor's shed to them as a profitable operation that was being run informally on Black River property, and that, with proper investment and management, could be turned into a genuine roadside enterprise. He had used her name, her cooking, her reputation, such as it was, built over 3 years, and then compounded by 6 weeks in the shed. He had used all of it to build a proposal that would, if it succeeded, result in Eleanor being removed from the shed entirely and replaced by a proper business arrangement with Dale himself positioned as the managing party. Eleanor sat with this information for a full minute without speaking. Emmett, across the table from her, watched her face. He's going to offer you a cut, Emmett said. That's what Patterson heard. He's going to come to you and offer you some percentage to stay on as the cook, operating under his terms. And if I refuse? Emmett's jaw shifted. Then he goes to Holt with a formal complaint about unauthorized use of property. The investors backing him. It's a more serious accusation. Eleanor looked at the notebook. She thought about the Harmon family, about Agnes Birch, who had written, I don't know what I am now, but tonight I was warm. She thought about the man from Tennessee and his mother's corn chowder. She thought about the boy with the formal nod who had eaten at her table before the sun came up and who she would probably never see again. Thinks, she said, that what I'm doing here is worth money. Apparently, he's wrong. She said it simply, not because it isn't valuable, but because the value of it depends completely on the fact that it isn't bought. Emmett looked at her. The moment I take his percentage, Eleanor said, I'm his cook. And the moment I'm his cook, the door isn't open anymore. It's a business door. And a business door opens for paying customers and closes for everyone else. She turned the notebook over in her hands. That's not what this is. I know that, Emmett said. But Dale won't care. No, she agreed, he won't. She put the notebook back on the shelf. The stove was burning steady and clean. Outside, the December dark had settled full over the Kansas prairie. And somewhere down the road, those 2 investors were probably sitting in a warm room talking about opportunity and return on investment, and the interesting woman cooking out of an old shed on Black River property. What are you going to do? Emmett asked. For the second time in as many weeks, the question had become something between them, not quite a ritual, but a consistent thing, a marker of how far they had come. Eleanor thought for a moment. I'm going to cook breakfast tomorrow, she said, and the day after, and I'm going to start writing down every name in that notebook, and every date, and every story I can remember. Because if Dale Pruitt is going to make a legal case against me, I'm going to have my own case ready. Emmett was quiet. Then what kind of case? Community, she said. That's what I've been building. And a community isn't a business. A community is a different thing entirely, and I don't think Dale Pruitt has any idea what to do with a different thing. She was right about that. She was less right, though she didn't know it yet, about how much time she had before he would try to find out. The offer came 3 days before Christmas. Dale Pruitt came himself, which surprised her. She had expected a go-between, had expected the whole thing to arrive with a layer of insulation between Dale and whatever discomfort the conversation might produce. But he came himself in the middle of the afternoon, when the shed was between its dinner crowd and its evening visitors, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, in a posture that was clearly calculated to appear conciliatory and was not quite convincing. "Can I come in?" he said. Eleanor stepped back from the doorway. He looked around the shed as he entered the repaired shelves. The clean stove, the table with its 4 mismatched chairs, the notebook on its shelf, the small bunch of dried herbs hanging from a rafter that one of the ranch wives had brought as a gift. His face was carefully neutral, but Eleanor caught something behind the neutrality. Not admiration, more like the expression of a man recalculating. He sat down at the table without being invited. Eleanor remained standing. "I'll get to it," he said. "I've got 2 businessmen interested in this operation. Men with capital. They've seen what you've built here and they think it's viable." He paused. "I think it's viable, is that so? Properly run with real investment, this could be something significant. A roadside establishment with your cooking as the draw. I'm proposing a formal arrangement. You stay on as head cook, you get a percentage of the profits, and the operation gets set up correctly legal, sustainable, with proper backing." He looked at her. "You've been doing this on nothing. You don't have to do that." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Who runs it?" she said. "I manage the business side, you run the kitchen. And the people who can't pay?" He what? "People who come through here with nothing. The families. The travelers who are between one hard thing and the next hard thing. The ones who eat because I don't ask what's in their pockets." She kept her voice even. "What happens to them in your arrangement?" Dale shifted in his chair. "Proper business has to be financially sustainable, Eleanor." "Can't. That's the answer," she said. "The answer is they go without." "That's not necessarily it is. The math doesn't work any other way. If you're running a business, you're running it for paying customers. And the people who've been coming here aren't paying customers. They're people." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not interested in your arrangement." Dale's conciliatory posture eroded. Not completely, he was a controlled man, but enough. "You're not thinking about this clearly. Right now, you're one complaint away from being removed from this shed entirely. One formal filing. I've got men willing to attest that you're operating commercially on Holt's property without authorization." "Those men would be lying," Eleanor said. "Doesn't always matter." He stood up, replacing his hat with the deliberate motions of a man who has decided the conversation is over on his terms. "Think about it. You've got a week before I take this to the next level. A week to decide whether you want a percentage of something real or nothing from something that was always going to get shut down." He walked to the door, stopped. "You're not young," he said. It was not said with particular cruelty, just plainly, as a statement of fact meant to land somewhere useful. "You won't always be able to do this. A business arrangement would protect you." Eleanor said nothing. He left. She stood in the shed for a full minute after the door closed. Stove ticked. Outside, a horse somewhere on the property made a sound, and then stopped. The notebook sat on its shelf. She was not going to take his offer. That was settled before he finished his first sentence. But she was also not naive about what came after the complaint, the formal filing, the investors with their capital and their paperwork turning up at Gerald Holt's door with something that looked official. She was a widow in her 40s running an unlicensed kitchen out of a repaired shed on someone else's property. She had no husband's name, no money of consequence, no legal standing that she was aware of. What she had was a notebook with 200 names in it. People who had sat at her table, people who had written their names and their stories in her book, people who were in some cases still within a day's ride of Black River Ranch. She pulled the notebook off the shelf and sat down at the table and began very methodically to make a different kind of list. Emmett found her there an hour later, writing by lamplight with a concentration that made him stop in the doorway before he spoke. "What are you doing?" he said. "Making an inventory," she said, without looking up. Came and looked over her shoulder. The list had 20 names on it so far, each with a note beside it, a description of who they were, where they had come from, what they had left in the notebook. Several had locations attached, because Eleanor had a good memory for where people said they were heading. "An inventory of what?" Emmett said. "Of the people who've been here," she said. "Of the ones who might come back, or who might be reachable." She looked up. "Dale wants to file a complaint. He wants to make this look like a commercial operation I've been running without authorization." She looked back at the list. "I want to make it look like what it actually is." Emmett sat down beside her and looked at the list for a long time. "That's a lot of people," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "It is. You think they'd come forward? Speak up for what you've built here." Eleanor thought about Robert Harmon, who had eaten 3 plates of venison roast, with the stunned expression of a man remembering that the world could still surprise him. She thought about Agnes Birch, who didn't know what she was anymore, but had been warm for a night. She thought about Clem, who was 19 years old and was learning, in real time, that adulthood involved choosing which kind of person you were going to be. Some of them, she said. Not all, but some. Outside, the December night was pressing in, and the Kansas prairie was doing what it always did in winter, going enormous and cold and indifferent in every direction. But in the shed, the stove was running clean, and the lamplight was steady, and Eleanor Whitaker was still writing names, one after another, building the only kind of argument she had ever known how to build. Not with money, not with authority, not with power borrowed from a husband or an employer or anyone else. With the simple, stubborn, irrefutable record of people who had been here, who had eaten at this table, and who had, in one way or another, left a piece of themselves in a worn notebook on a shelf in an old shed on the Kansas frontier. Dale Pruitt had a week. Eleanor intended to use every hour of it. The week Dale gave her didn't last the week. On the fourth day, a Wednesday, 2 days before Christmas, Eleanor was at the stove before dawn when she heard boots on the frozen ground outside, more than one set, coming at a pace that wasn't casual. She had learned, over the past weeks, to read the sounds of people approaching the shed, the way a person learns to read weather by the quality of them. Speed, what they suggested about what was coming. These boots suggested nothing good. She turned from the stove as the door opened. Dale came in first, and behind him came two men she had never seen before. Both were well dressed by frontier standards, clean coats, good boots, hats that hadn't been beaten into shapelessness by years of weather. One was perhaps 50, with a gray beard trimmed close and eyes that moved around the shed like a man taking an inventory. The other was younger, maybe 35, and had the particular stillness of someone who does not speak unless speaking is useful. Behind them both came Gerald Holt. That was the thing Eleanor hadn't expected. Gerald Holt, in his barn coat and his squinting expression, standing in the doorway of her shed at 5:30 in the morning, looking like a man who had been woken up earlier than he'd planned and was not entirely sure what he'd agreed to by coming. Dale stepped forward. He was wearing the expression Eleanor had seen on him once before, the calculated neutrality of someone who has decided the conversation and is now simply performing it for an audience. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I'd like you to meet Mr. Warren Collier and Mr. James Fitch. They're the investors I mentioned." Eleanor looked at the two men, then she looked at Gerald Holt. Holt met her eyes briefly and then looked at the wall, which told her a considerable amount about how the morning had gone for him so far. 5:30, Eleanor said. "We're aware," Dale said. "Mr. Collier and Mr. Fitch have a schedule to keep. They're heading south this afternoon." The older man, Collier, stepped forward and extended his hand. "Mrs. Whitaker, I've heard a great deal about what you've built here." He looked around the shed with the assessing expression she'd clocked on him at entry, not unkind, but utterly transactional. The look of a man for whom everything in his field of vision is either an asset or a liability. "Remarkable, what you've done with a space like this." "The shed," Eleanor said. Collier smiled. It was a practiced smile. "That's rather the point. The story of it, the cook who was pushed out of the main kitchen and built something better in the back that's marketable. People respond to that kind of narrative." "It's not a narrative," Eleanor said. "It's what happened, of course." The smile didn't move, which makes it authentic. Authenticity is very valuable right now. Eleanor looked at Dale, who was watching this exchange with the expression of a man waiting for a predetermined conclusion to arrive on schedule. "Mr. Holt," Eleanor said. Gerald Holt looked at her properly for the first time since he'd come through the door. "Did you know they were coming this morning?" she said. Pause. Small but real. Dale mentioned he had some people who wanted to see the operation. "The operation," she said. Mrs. Whitaker, Dale started. "I'm talking to Mr. Holt." She kept her voice level, quiet even. The kind of quiet that isn't calm so much as controlled. "Did he tell you what they're proposing to do with my kitchen?" Holt's jaw tightened. "He mentioned an investment arrangement." "He wants to buy it," Eleanor said. "Not from me, I don't own it. He wants to buy the right to run it, commercially, on your property, and put himself in charge of it, and keep me on as the cook if I agree to his terms." She paused. "Tell you that part?" The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Collier and Fitch exchanged a glance that was almost imperceptible. Dale's expression did not change, but something around his eyes did a tightening, small and quick. Holt looked at Dale. "That what you proposed?" "It's more nuanced than Is that what you proposed?" Dale set his hat more firmly on his head. "The framework is more complex, Gerald. The investment model would..." "I asked a yes or no question," Holt said. Another silence. Yes, Dale said, in broad terms. Holt exhaled slowly through his nose. He looked around the shed, the stove, the shelves, the table, the notebook on its shelf, and he looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor could see him recalibrating, adding information to a picture he'd been given partially, and was only now seeing whole. "Give us a minute," Holt said to Dale. "Gerald, I think we should give us a minute, Dale." It was the first time Eleanor had heard Gerald Holt use that particular tone with Dale Pruitt. Flat, conclusive. The tone of an employer who has remembered, after a period of forgetting, that he is the employer. Dale took Collier and Fitch outside, the door closed. Holt stood in Eleanor's shed and looked at her. She looked back. "He didn't tell me it was your kitchen he was selling," Holt said. He said it simply, without excessive apology, but with the plainness of a man acknowledging an error. "No," she said. "I wouldn't think he would." "What did he tell you when he came to you with it?" "That I'd get a percentage, a cut of the profits, in exchange for staying on as cook under his management." She moved to the stove, checked the heat under the oatmeal she'd been making when they arrived, lowered it slightly. "I said no, and then he brought the investors here anyway." "And then he brought the investors here anyway," she agreed. Holt was quiet for a moment. He looked at the notebook. "What's that?" Eleanor hesitated for just a moment, not because she was unwilling to show him, but because the notebook had become, over the past weeks, something she was instinctively protective of in a way that went beyond its practical value. It contained things people had entrusted to her, and that trust was not hers to hand over carelessly, even to Gerald Holt. She took it off the shelf and gave it to him. He opened it at the beginning and read slowly. Not quickly, the way a man reads something he's looking for a specific piece of information in, but properly, the way you read something that requires attention. He turned pages. His expression shifted not dramatically, but it shifted. He got to Martha Harmon's entry. Read it. Got to Agnes Birch's entry. Read it twice. He closed the notebook and held it for a moment before handing it back. "How many names?" he said. 211 as of last night." He was quiet. "This isn't a business," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a man saying a thing out loud that he was in the process of understanding. "No," Eleanor said, "it isn't." Holt moved to the door. Then he stopped with his hand on the frame. "Dale's been with me 6 years," he said. Not as a defense, she could hear that. More like he was acknowledging the weight of what was on the other side of whatever decision was coming. "I know," Eleanor said. "He's good at what he does." "He is." Holt nodded, then he went outside. Eleanor stood at her stove and stirred the oatmeal and listened to the murmur of voices on the other side of the door without being able to make out words. Conversation lasted about 15 minutes. Then she heard boots leaving more than 2 sets, moving away toward the main house, and then a single set returning. Emmett came through the door. "You know what just happened?" he said. "Some of it. Holt sent the investors away." Emmett sat down. He looked like a man who has been holding his breath and has just been given permission to exhale. Told Dale the arrangement wasn't sanctioned, and he should have come to him before bringing outside parties onto the property. He paused. Dale didn't take it well. "No," Eleanor said. "I wouldn't think he would." "He's not done," Emmett said. It wasn't a warning exactly, just a statement of fact from a man who had been watching Dale Pruitt operate for 2 years and knew the shape of his persistence. "This was one move, he's got others." "I know, Eleanor." He waited until she looked at him. "He's going to go after your character next. Not the operation you. Who you are. What kind of woman runs an unlicensed kitchen and lets strangers in at all hours." He said it plainly, because she needed to hear it plainly. Out here that kind of talk does damage. She knew that too. She had always known that. A woman without a husband, without family connections, without the kind of social architecture that gave other women protection from certain accusations. She had always known that she was one determined enemy, away from the kind of trouble that didn't care whether you were innocent. "Then I need to move faster than him," she said. She had started making the list 4 days ago. She had kept working on it every spare hour since names, dates, locations, the brief descriptions she could remember of what each person had shared with her. 23 names had locations she thought were reachable within a day or two. 11 of those were close enough that a writer could get there and back before Dale Pruitt could file whatever he was planning to file. She needed Emmett to ride. She asked him. He didn't hesitate. "Which names first?" She gave him 6. The ones she was most sure of, people who had seemed, in the time she'd spent with them, the kind of people who would show up for something like this. Robert Harmon, who had said when he left that if Eleanor ever needed anything, she had only to send word to the homestead he was building near Hutchinson. A rancher's wife named Clara Denby, who had come twice and left 2 recipes, and a strong opinion about Dale Pruitt's character that Eleanor had not solicited but had noted. A freighter named Amos Pratt, who had eaten at Eleanor's table 6 times now, and who seemed to know everyone on the road between Black River and Wichita. Emmett rode out before 8 in the morning. Eleanor cooked. Cooked because the alternative was to sit still with the anxiety of the thing, and she was not built for sitting still with anxiety. She made a full breakfast for the morning crowd, which was 9 people that day, 5 ranch hands, a married couple passing through, who had heard about the shed from someone in town, and Clem, who showed up with the specific energy of a young man who has heard that something is happening and wants to be near it without knowing exactly what his role is. Is it true Holt threw those investors out? Clem said, sitting down at the table with both elbows on it. He asked them to leave, Eleanor said. Same thing. Not entirely. Clem watched her work. He was quiet for a moment, which was slightly unusual for him. Then, Dale's telling people you manipulated Holt. Got to him before the investors could make their pitch. Eleanor put a plate in front of him. Eat. That's what he's saying. I heard you. She went back to the stove. What people say is not always the thing that matters. What matters then? She thought about this genuinely, because Clem was 19 years old and asking real questions, and he deserved real answers. What people do, she said, and what can be proven. Clem ate. He looked at the notebook on the shelf. You really think having 200 names in a book is going to stop Dale from doing whatever he wants to do? I don't know, Eleanor said, but I know it's what I've got. Christmas came and went, in the strange, muffled way that holidays do, when you're in the middle of something difficult present, but not quite landing, like a sound heard through a wall. Catherine Holt had come to the shed on Christmas Eve with a covered dish and a look on her face that combined sympathy and that particular Kansas woman's stoicism in roughly equal measure. She had not said much. She had left the dish a sweet potato pudding, which made Eleanor think immediately of Martha Harmon's entry in the notebook, and squeezed Eleanor's hand once at the door. Emmett came back on the 27th with Robert Harmon. Eleanor was in the middle of the lunch service when the buckboard pulled up outside, and she looked through the small window in the shed's east wall and saw Emmett's horse, and then a second wagon, and when the door opened and Robert Harmon walked in taller than she remembered, or maybe she had remembered him smaller because he'd been so hollowed out by hunger, that first night she was so surprised that she set down her ladle mid-stir. Mrs. Whitaker, he said. His hat was in his hands. Mr. Harmon. She found her voice. You came. Your man found me in Hutchinson. He glanced at Emmett, who had come in behind him. Martha sends her love. She would have come, but the girl's got a cough, and she didn't want to leave her. He looked around the shed. This is it? This is what they're trying to take from you. This is it. He walked to the center of the shed and stood there turning slowly, looking at the shelves and the stove and the table and the notebook, the same way he'd looked at his empty plate that first night. Eleanor thought with that particular focused attention of someone who has understood the value of something by having been without it. You fed my family, he said. You didn't have to. You didn't ask for anything. I know. And now some man wants to take this and put a price on it. Approximately right. Robert Harmon sat down at the table, put his hands flat on the surface. What do you need from me? Eleanor told him. What she needed, she had decided in the days since Dale's visit, was not a confrontation, not a petition, not a protest, not any of the things that loud fights became when they were written up and filed and interpreted by men who weren't present for them. What she needed was testimony. Simple, factual, first-hand testimony from people who had been here who could say, in plain language, what this place was and what it was not. She needed enough of it that when Dale Pruitt took his complaint to Gerald Holt, or to whoever was above Gerald Holt if he intended to go that route, the complaint would arrive in a room already occupied by a different story. Truer story. Robert Harmon understood this immediately, which told Eleanor something about him. That he was a practical man who dealt in real things and had no patience for misdirection. Write it down for me, he said. What I should say and what form it takes. Eleanor wrote it down. Amos Pratt arrived 2 days after that, riding alone in the particular easy way of a man who had spent most of his life on a horse. He came in, ate 3 bowls of soup without commentary, and then said, All right, tell me what you need. He was not a man who required a long explanation of why something mattered. He had been coming to the shed for 2 months. He had watched it go from a repaired stove and one woman to what it was now. He understood what it was. What Amos Pratt had, beyond his own testimony, was something Eleanor hadn't anticipated. He knew people, not in the social sense, but in the freight route sense. He moved along the same roads week after week, and he talked to everyone he encountered. And the news of Eleanor's shed and Dale Pruitt's attempt to commercialize it had been moving along those roads faster than Eleanor had known. There are people who haven't been here but who've heard about it, Amos said. Ranchers, families. There's a woman in Larned who lost her husband last spring and who's been looking for, I don't know how to put it, a place to put her energy. She heard about what you're doing. He looked at Eleanor. There's more than 200 names in that world, Mrs. Whitaker. There's a lot more. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. Changed the shape of what she was building. She had been thinking of this as a defensive action, gathering enough evidence to resist Dale's attack. But what Amos was describing was something larger, something that had been growing without her tending it. The way certain things grow when the conditions are right, and no one is trying to control them. The shed had become a story. It had been passing from person to person along the freight roads and the cattle trails and the small conversations between strangers at watering stops. And the story it told was the one Eleanor had been living, but had never consciously decided to broadcast. A woman who had been pushed out of her kitchen had built something better with her own hands and opened the door to anyone who came. That story had been walking around Kansas for 2 months without Eleanor's permission. Clara Denby arrived on the 30th of December with her husband's buckboard, her second-best hat, and a disposition for direct action that Eleanor found immediately bracing. Clara was 47, a rancher's wife who had spent 20 years being the kind of person other people in her community turned to when things needed to be organized. She had decided without being asked, and without a great deal of deliberation, that Eleanor Whitaker's situation was a thing that needed organizing. "You've been too quiet about this," Clara said, sitting across from Eleanor at the table with a cup of coffee and her hat still on. "I understand why. You don't want to make enemies you don't have to make. Quiet has a time, and quiet has a limit, and you've reached the limit." "I'm not interested in a fight," Eleanor said. "Good," Clara said. "A fight is what Dale wants. He knows how to fight. He's been fighting people on his own terms his whole career. What he doesn't know how to do is respond to something that isn't a fight." She put her cup down. "Got people. You've got that notebook. You've got testimony from 2 men who were here with their families and who'll stand up for what this place is. What you don't have is someone who knows how to present it to Gerald Holt in a way that makes it impossible to dismiss. And you know how to do that?" "I've been doing it since I was 25, Clara said. "Different context. Same principle. You make it real. You make it specific. You make it so that dismissing it means dismissing real people with real names. And men like Gerald Holt, decent men who want to do right, but need to be shown exactly what right looks like, will not dismiss real people if you put the real people in front of them." Eleanor looked at her. "I'm saying bring them here," Clara said. "Don't write letters. Don't send testimony by messenger. Bring the people." The first week of January arrived cold and bright, with a hard frost that cracked the ground and made the shed's repaired roof creak in a way that kept Eleanor awake for the first 2 nights until she was certain it would hold. She was dealing with 3 things simultaneously, which was not unusual for her, but which required a kind of distributed attention she had to work to maintain. The first was the shed itself. It still needed to function, still needed to feed people every day. Because the moment it stopped being a real thing was the moment it became only a dispute. The second was the list Emmett was still riding, carrying word to names Eleanor had flagged, and Amos Pratt had become, without any formal agreement, something close to a communications system, passing information along the freight roads with the easy efficiency of a man who was moving anyway. The third was Dale. Dale had gone quiet after the Christmas incident with the investors, which Eleanor recognized as more dangerous than noise. A quiet Dale was a Dale who was thinking, and a thinking Dale was working on the next move. She did not know what that move was. She knew it was coming. It came on the 8th of January. She found out from Clem, who came to her before breakfast, with a face that said he had been awake, worrying about how to deliver what he was carrying. He stood in the doorway of the shed and told her that Dale Pruitt had filed a formal complaint with the county land office in Wichita, not with Gerald Holt, with the county. The complaint alleged that an unlicensed commercial eating establishment was being operated on Black River Ranch property without the consent of the property owner, that it constituted a liability risk, and that it had been drawing transient persons onto private land in a manner inconsistent with the property's designated use. It was, Eleanor recognized immediately, a smarter move than the investor scheme. This went around Gerald Holt entirely, which meant Gerald Holt was no longer the decision-maker. A county complaint meant county involvement, which meant paperwork and inspections and official processes that a cook in a repaired shed had no institutional mechanism to navigate. She sat down at her table and read the copy of the complaint that Clem had managed to obtain. She didn't ask how, and she read it carefully 3 times. It was well written. She had to acknowledge that. Dale was good at paperwork, had always been good at paperwork, and the complaint was exactly specific enough to seem credible, and exactly vague enough to resist easy refutation. The language of unlicensed commercial establishment was particularly effective because it didn't require proof of profit. It required only proof that an establishment existed and that it served the public. Both of those things were true. She put the paper down and looked at Emmett, who had arrived while she was reading. "County," he said. "County," she confirmed. "That's a different thing." "Yes." Emmett was quiet for a moment then. "Do you know anyone at the county land office?" "No," Eleanor said. "Do you?" he thought. "There's a man, Wes Alderman. He's a deputy recorder. I went to school with his younger brother years back, before I came out here." He paused. "I don't know if that means anything. Could you talk to him? I could ride to Wichita. Could you ride tomorrow?" He looked at her. Then he nodded. Clara Denby, when Eleanor told her about the county complaint that afternoon, did not look surprised. She looked, instead, like a woman whose prediction has been confirmed, and who is already 3 steps ahead. "He always intended to go county," Clara said. "The investor scheme was a test. He wanted to see if you'd take the offer, and when you didn't, he wanted to see if Holt would back him. Holt didn't, not fully. So he took it somewhere. Holt can't protect you." She sat with her coffee. "He's not wrong that a county complaint is harder to fight. I know. But he's assuming you don't have any standing to contest it. I don't have much." "You have 200 people," Clara said. "And that is standing if you use it correctly." She looked at Eleanor. "I want to write to the county myself, as a rancher's wife, property owner in this county, formally on my husband's letterhead, which will matter more than it should, but will matter." Eleanor hesitated. "I'm not asking permission," Clara said. "I'm telling you what I'm doing. You can have opinions about it if you want." Eleanor almost smiled. "Write the letter." Emmett came back from Wichita 3 days later with the kind of information that reorders a situation. Wes Alderman, the deputy recorder, had looked at the complaint and had looked at Emmett and had said, with the careful neutrality of a public official who has opinions he is choosing not to state officially, that the complaint as filed was missing a key element documentation from the property owner confirming that the operation was being conducted without his consent, which meant Gerald Holt's position on the shed, which had been deliberately ambiguous since their December conversation, was now the hinge point. If Holt signed a statement confirming he had not consented, the complaint had legs. If Holt declined to sign, or signed a statement that characterized the arrangement differently, the complaint became significantly more complicated to act on. Eleanor went to the main house for the second time. Gerald Holt met her in the same office. He looked different this time, or rather he looked like a man who had been having a difficult few weeks and who was tired of the difficulty. His desk had papers on it that she didn't try to read. "You've heard about the county complaint," he said. "Yes. Dale's asking me to sign a statement confirming the operation was unauthorized." "I know." Holt folded his hands on his desk. "Is it authorized?" Eleanor met his eyes. "You never explicitly authorized it. You told me to stay within lines and keep records. I've done both." She paused. "I don't think you intended what I built, but I don't think you intended the alternative either. The alternative being Dale running a commercial operation on my property. That would have required your authorization too." Holt was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the window at the yard, at the shed visible in the mid-distance with its patched roof and its thin thread of wood smoke rising from the stovepipe. "He came to me with the investor proposal formally," Holt said. "Me to authorize it." I said no. He turned back to her. "He filed the county complaint the next morning." Eleanor hadn't known this, processed it carefully. "He filed the complaint after you refused him?" "Yes." She looked at Gerald Holt across his desk and saw something she had been waiting, without quite knowing she was waiting, for him to arrive at. Not anger. Holt was too controlled for obvious anger. But the cold, clear-eyed recognition of a man who has understood that he has been managed. Dale had not gone to the county to protect Gerald Holt's property. He had gone to the county because Gerald Holt had told him no, and Dale Pruitt did not accept no from the people who were supposed to be below him. Not from Eleanor, and not when it came to something he wanted badly enough, from his employer. "I'm not signing the statement," Holt said. Eleanor let out a breath that she had not known she was holding. "Thank you." I'm also going to write to the county land office myself. He said it flatly, without drama, the way men say things they've decided and don't need to discuss further, clarifying that the use of the shed was within the scope of Mrs. Whitaker's employment arrangement and that no unauthorized commercial operation has occurred on Black River property. That's not entirely accurate, Eleanor said. No, Holt agreed. But it's close enough, and it's my property and my characterization to make. He looked at her. You understand this doesn't settle things with Dale. I know, he's going to push back. He has a way of not letting things go. I know that too. She stood Mr. Holt. The people who've been coming to the shed there are more than 200 of them now. People who've passed through and left their names. Some of them are on their way here. Not because I asked them all. Because word travels. She held his eyes. I want you to meet them. He looked at her for a long moment. When Saturday, she said, if you're willing. He nodded. Once. Slow. She walked back across the frozen yard to the shed, and as she went she was doing the mathematics of what she had and what she still needed, and how much time was between now and Saturday and whether it was enough. Robert Harmon was there when she arrived, helping Emmett carry wood. Amos Pratt was at the table, and Clara Denby was standing near the shelf with the notebook in her hands, reading it the way Holt had read it slowly, with real attention. 3 people she hadn't invited who had come anyway. Eleanor stopped in the doorway and looked at them. These 3 people who had no obligation to her and who were here regardless, felt something that was not quite pride and not quite gratitude, but was in the territory of both, a feeling she associated with the rarest of things, was finding out that the world contained more decency than your most recent experience of it suggested. Saturday, she said. Holt is going to meet people. Clara looked up from the notebook. How many do we have? Eleanor thought about Amos's network, about Emmett's rides, about the story moving along the freight roads on its own momentum. Enough, she said. I think we have enough. She wasn't certain, but she went to the stove and started the evening meal, because, uncertain or not, people were going to be hungry, and feeding them was still the thing she knew how to do first and best, and with everything she had. Outside, the January dark was coming down over the Kansas prairie, hard and clear and cold, and somewhere in Wichita, Dale Pruitt was almost certainly working on his next move. But in the shed, the fire was burning, and the notebook was on its shelf with 223 names in it, and Eleanor Whitaker had an appointment on Saturday that she did not intend to miss. Saturday arrived the way important days sometimes do, ordinary on the surface, cold and gray and unremarkable to look at, with nothing in the light or the air to signal that it was different from any other January morning on the Kansas prairie. Eleanor had been up since 3:30. She had not slept well. Not badly either. She had passed through that particular kind of night, where you drift in and out of something that resembles sleep without committing to it, your mind running a low, steady current of calculation beneath the surface. She had lain on her cot in the shed and listened to the stove tick as it cooled and thought about the notebook and about Gerald Holt's face when he said he wasn't signing the statement and about Dale Pruitt, somewhere in the dark working on whatever came next. By 4 o'clock she had given up on sleep and started the fires. She cooked for 3 hours before the first wagon arrived. Clara Denby came first. Before 7, with her husband's buckboard loaded with things she had gathered from her own kitchen, 2 large pots, an extra cutting board, a quantity of dried corn she said she'd been meaning to do something with for 2 months. She came through the shed door with the brisk efficiency of someone who has been organizing things since the sun was properly up, and who has no patience for any discussion about whether the organizing is welcome. Where do you want the pot? She said. On the bench outside, Eleanor said. We're going to need the room in here. Clara nodded and went back out. Eleanor heard her directing her husband, a quiet man named Henry, who had the disposition of someone accustomed to being directed on where to set things. Robert Harmon arrived at 7:30 with Martha and their daughter Clara, who was no longer coughing. The girl was 8 years old and had the alert, observant quality of a child who has traveled enough to be comfortable in new places, and she stood in the doorway of the shed and looked at everything with a focused calm that made Eleanor think of the boy, the summer shirt, the formal nod, the beginning of all of this. My wife made something, Robert said, handing Eleanor a wrapped parcel. Inside was a sweet potato pudding. Martha had made the recipe she'd written in the notebook, which meant she'd carried it with her, all the way from Hutchinson, which meant she had been thinking about it. Eleanor looked at the pudding and then looked at Martha Harmon and could not find the right words for what she felt. So she simply said, "This is going to be the best thing on the table today." And Martha's expression did something complicated and good. Amos Pratt came at 8 with 4 people she had never seen: 2 men and a woman and an older man who walked with a cane and who turned out to be a retired county judge named Beaumont, who had heard about the shed from Amos on the road between Larned and Great Bend, and who had insisted, with the polite implacability of a man used to having his preferences honored, on being brought along. Eleanor looked at the retired judge and then at Amos with an expression that she hoped communicated something. Amos shrugged. "He's retired," he said, "but he's still a judge." By 9 o'clock there were 11 people at the shed, and by 9:30 there were 16. And Eleanor had stopped trying to track arrivals and simply directed people to the space she had: the shed itself, the bench outside, cleared area near the east wall that she'd swept clean the previous afternoon, in optimistic preparation for exactly this. Emmett was everywhere. This was the thing Eleanor noticed and would think about later: the way Emmett Hayes moved through that morning without being asked, carrying things and fixing things, and finding the right place to stand when someone needed a steady presence, and doing all of it with the quiet self-sufficiency that was characteristic of him. The quality she had observed from the first week in the shed, and which she had come to understand, was not detachment, but its opposite. Cared, he was just not loud about it. Gerald Holt arrived at 10 o'clock. He did not come alone. He brought his wife, Catherine, which surprised Eleanor. She had not expected Catherine, had not planned for Catherine. And the presence of the ranch owner's wife changed the register of the morning in ways that were immediate and somewhat difficult to calibrate. Catherine Holt was a woman who understood, better than her husband in certain respects, the social weight of her presence in a situation, and the fact that she had come meant she had chosen to come, which meant she had decided the shed was worth showing up for. Holt stopped in the yard outside the shed and looked at the people gathered there. Eleanor counted there were 23 people now, with several more coming down the road. Holt looked at all of them for a long moment, and Eleanor, watching from near the shed door, could see him adjusting his understanding of the scale of the thing. He had expected, she thought, a small gathering, a handful of people. He had not expected this. Clara Denby materialized at his elbow with the confident ease of a woman who has greeted important people before and who knows that the first 30 seconds of such a greeting sets the terms for everything that follows. "Mr. Holt," she said, "Clara Denby. My husband Henry runs the Denby spread about 12 miles east of you. Thank you for coming." Holt shook her hand. "Mrs. Denby, there are some people I'd like you to meet," Clara said, and steered him gently but unmistakably toward Robert Harmon, who was standing nearby with his hat in his hands and the straightforward expression of a man who has decided what he is going to say and is ready to say it. Eleanor watched this and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that loosened slightly in her chest. She went back to the stove. The morning unfolded in a way that Eleanor had hoped for, but had not allowed herself to count on, because counting on things you hope for is a particular kind of risk that she had learned, over the years, to be careful about. Moved through the gathered people with Clara Denby, acting as an informal guide, and one by one he heard the accounts, not dramatic, not rehearsed, but plain and specific and first-hand, in the way that things are when they come from people who were there. Robert Harmon told him about the night in December, not emotionally, not with the kind of performance that would have made it feel calculated, but in the flat, practical language of a man describing what had happened. "My family was out of money. The wheel had taken most of what we had left. My daughter was cold, and we hadn't eaten since the morning before. Mrs. Whitaker fed us. She didn't ask for anything. Told my wife to keep her coins because we'd need them in Colorado." He paused. "We're in Colorado now. We came back for this because it seemed like the least we could do." Amos Pratt told Holt about the freight roads, about the way Eleanor's shed had become a piece of information that moved between travelers not as a business. He was specific about this, but as the kind of knowledge people passed along, because it was useful in the way that a reliable water source is useful, or a road that doesn't flood. "People know she won't turn them away," Amos said. "That's the whole thing. There aren't that many places like that out here." Tired Judge Beaumont did not make a speech. He simply told Holt that he had spent 30 years in county proceedings, that he had read the complaint filed against Eleanor Whitaker, and that in his experience the difference between a public nuisance and a community institution was almost entirely a matter of who was telling the story, and to whom. "Complaint is technically coherent," he said. "It's also a misrepresentation of what's actually here, and the county recorder's office will figure that out eventually, but eventually can take a long time." He looked at Holt. A letter from the property owner will settle it faster. Holt listened. He was good at listening. Eleanor had always thought so. He asked questions that were specific and practical, the questions of a man who needs to understand the mechanics of something before he can decide about it. He did not perform emotion. He did not seem moved in any visible way. But he was paying attention in the full sense of the word, and Eleanor, watching from her position near the stove, where she had kept herself deliberately in the background, understood that this was what Clara had meant about making it real and specific and impossible to dismiss. It was noon before Dale Pruitt arrived. Eleanor heard him before she saw him, the particular quality of his boots on the frozen ground, the pace she had learned to recognize. She was at the stove with her back to the door, when she heard the sound of the gathering outside change, a subtle shift in the conversational register that told her something had altered. Turned. Dale stood in the yard. He had stopped some 20 feet from the main cluster of people and was looking at the gathered crowd with an expression Eleanor had not seen on him before, not anger. Not the controlled neutrality he usually deployed, but something rawer than either of those. The expression of a man who has walked into a room expecting to find it empty and has found it full. His eyes moved from the people to Eleanor, standing in the shed doorway. She looked back at him and said nothing. He walked forward. People did not part for him exactly, but they shifted the way a crowd shifts when someone moves through it with intention, and he came through them to stand in front of Eleanor with Gerald Holt 5 feet to his left, and Clara Denby and Robert Harmon beyond that. "What is this?" Dale said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing, he didn't raise it, which in Dale's case was more alarming than raising it would have been. "People came," Eleanor said. "I can see that." He looked at Holt. "Gerald, this is—" "I know what it is, Dale," Holt said. He said it without particular heat, but the tone was the same one. Eleanor had heard in December flat and conclusive the employer voice. "You're being maneuvered," Dale said. He said it with the conviction of a man who has watched the thing he feared come true, and who is now making one last argument against the evidence. Been running a campaign, getting these people here to Gerald. You have to look at this clearly. This is organized. People organize themselves, Amos Pratt said from somewhere behind Holt. Not aggressively, just factually. Dale looked at him. Then at Harmon, then at Clara Denby, who was watching him with the particular expression of a woman who has taken a full and accurate measure of a man and is not impressed by what she found. "You have no right to be on this property," Dale said to Harmon. "He's a guest," Eleanor said. "You don't have the authority to invite." "She does today," Holt said. The silence that followed was not long. Maybe 5 seconds. But it had the quality of a longer silence. It was the silence in which something shifts in a way that everyone present can feel but no one quite names. Dale looked at Gerald Holt, and in his face, for just a moment, Eleanor saw the thing that Dale Pruitt was when the management fell away, not a villain exactly, because villains require a kind of committed malice that Dale had never quite had. He was something more ordinary and in some ways more troubling than a villain. He was a man who had built his entire self-concept on being the most important person in whatever room he occupied, and who had no internal resources for the moment when that wasn't true. "You're choosing her," he said to Holt. Said it quietly, almost without inflection. "I'm choosing what she built," Holt said. "Those aren't the same thing, but I can see how you'd conflate them." Dale stood for another moment. Then he turned and walked back through the gathered crowd and out the yard gate toward the main house, and nobody said anything until the sound of his boots had faded. Clara Denby let out a breath. Robert Harmon looked at the ground. Catherine Holt, who had been standing near the shed door the entire time and whom Eleanor had almost forgotten about, moved forward and touched Eleanor's arm briefly, not a dramatic gesture, just a touch, the kind that says, "I was here and I saw." Eleanor nodded. The afternoon that followed was not a triumph in the way Eleanor had imagined triumph looking, back in the dark days of December, when she had still been imagining it as a specific event, a moment of clear resolution. What it was instead was quieter and more gradual, the way real things tend to be. Holt spent 2 hours with the people in the yard, and then he went into the shed with Eleanor and sat at her table, and they talked for 40 minutes about what the shed was, and what the shed could become, and what Gerald Holt's formal position on it needed to be. He was not. Eleanor quickly understood, offering her anything she hadn't already built. He was catching up to a thing that had outpaced his understanding of it, and the catching up required him to formally acknowledge what he had let happen by omission over the past 2 months, that Eleanor Whitaker had created something real on his property, that it was not a commercial operation, and that he was prepared to put that in writing to the county recorder. The complaint will be dropped, he said. Wes Alderman will see to that. Once I send the letter. Thank you, Eleanor said. Holt looked at his hands. There's the matter of Dale. That's your matter, Eleanor said. Not mine. He looked at her. You're not going to tell me what you think I should do? No, she said. He works for you. What you decide about the men who work for you is between you and them. She paused. I'll tell you what I saw. For 6 years, he was good at the job. For the past few months, he's been using the job to pursue something personal. Those aren't contradictory facts. They're both true. Holt sat with this. He's going to be angry. He's already angry. Angrier then, if I have to take his authority back in certain areas. If I have to make clear that what he did with those investors and the county complaint was outside the line. He pressed his lips together. He'll see it as a betrayal. Maybe, Eleanor said. Or maybe he'll see it as what happens when a man oversteps. She looked at Holt steadily. That's between you two. I've got enough of my own to manage. Holt almost smiled, not quite, but almost. He left at 4 o'clock, and Catherine left with him, and Catherine turned back once at the yard gate and looked at Eleanor with an expression that Eleanor catalogued carefully and kept. It was not pity, and it was not admiration exactly. It was the look one woman gives another when she has watched her navigate something difficult without flinching, and she wants that fact acknowledged between them before it becomes just another part of the past. Eleanor acknowledged it. Catherine turned and followed her husband. The visitors began to leave, through the late afternoon Harmon family first, with their daughter wrapped tight against the January cold, and Martha pressing Eleanor's hand at the gate. Then Amos, who said he'd be back through in 2 weeks, and could he leave a few sacks of dried beans, because he had more than he needed and she could use them. Then Clara and Henry Denby, Clara with the notebook in her hand because she had been reading it again during the afternoon and wanted to finish a section. You should make copies, Clara said, handing it back. Of the names, at least. Keep one somewhere safe, I know, Eleanor said. I'll help with that next time I'm through. Clara studied her. You look tired. I am tired, good, Clara said. Tired means you've been doing something. She squeezed Eleanor's shoulder once, with the practical grip of a woman whose hands have worked their whole life, and got into the buckboard. Beaumont, the retired judge, was the last to leave. He sat at Eleanor's table for a long time after the others had gone, drinking a cup of coffee with the patient comfort of a man who has no particular schedule and no apologies about it. He was perhaps 70, with the large, still hands of someone whose hands had been important and had learned, in retirement, a different kind of purpose. How long have you been cooking? He said. Since I was 12, Eleanor said. My mother was sick for a long time. I started because someone had to, and you've been feeding people who needed it ever since. When I could, he turned his coffee cup in his hands. Complaint will be dropped. The letter from Holt will be enough. But you should know, Dale Pruitt isn't going to settle quietly. Men like that don't lose gracefully. I know. There might be other approaches, other angles. He said it carefully. The way legal men say things that they want to be heard as statements of fact rather than warnings. The county complaint was just the most direct. If he's inventive, there are other routes. Are you telling me I haven't won? I'm telling you, you've won this round. He finished his coffee and stood with the careful movement of a man whose joints require negotiation. You've built something people will protect. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. He looked around the shed one more time, the stove, the shelves, the notebook on its shelf, the table where 200 and more people had sat and eaten and written their names. Keep the notebook safe, he said. Whatever else happens. That book is your history, and your history is your only real protection. I know that, Eleanor said. He nodded. Got his coat. Left. Eleanor was alone in the shed for the first time all day. She sat at her table. The fire in the stove was low and needed attention, but she did not immediately give it attention. She sat and looked at the shed. Her shed, though she did not own it, had never owned it, and she let the day settle over her, the way exhaustion settles when you've been holding yourself upright through sheer will and the need is finally gone. She had won. For today she had won. But Beaumont was right, and she knew it without him saying so. Dale Pruitt was somewhere in the main house right now, or in his quarters, or possibly already on a horse to Wichita, and he was not the kind of man who accepted a Saturday afternoon in January as the final word on anything. Emmett came in around 5. He looked at her, sitting at the table, and said nothing for a moment. Just came in and went to the stove and added wood and rebuilt the fire without being asked, because by now this was simply something he did, the way certain shared habits form between people who spend enough time in the same space working toward the same ends. When the fire was going properly, he sat across from her. "Holt talked to Dale this afternoon," he said. Eleanor looked up. "What happened?" "Pulled his authority to deal with the county or any external parties on ranch business without prior approval. Told him the complaint was going to be retracted." He paused. Dale asked if he was being dismissed. Holt said no. Said he was being corrected. "How did Dale take it?" "About how you'd expect." Emmett turned his hat in his hands to tell the assembling. "He's not done, Eleanor. I want to be clear about that. Today went about as well as it could have gone, and it still doesn't mean he's done." Beaumont said the same thing. "Smart man." Former judge. "Even smarter." Emmett set his hat flat on the table. "What do you need to do next?" Eleanor thought about it. Really thought, not the surface-level contingency planning she'd been doing for weeks, but the deeper kind. What was the thing that needed to happen, now that the immediate crisis had a resolution, even a temporary one? "I need to make this permanent," she said. Not in the way Dale wanted, not a business, but in a way that it can't be threatened so easily. She looked at the stove, then at the notebook. Right now it exists because Gerald Holt hasn't shut it down. It's not a foundation. A thing can only exist because someone hasn't said no to it for so long before someone finds a new way to say no. What would permanent look like? She had been thinking about this without naming it for longer than she'd realized. "The shed isn't mine," she said. "The stove isn't mine. The land isn't mine. If Holt sells the ranch or decides he's had enough of the complications, or if something happens to him, it's gone." She looked at Emmett. "I need land, not much. Even a small piece. Something with a structure on it or the ability to build one." Emmett was quiet for a long time. "Land costs money." "I know. You don't have much." "I know that too." She'd been saving for years quietly, carefully, the way someone saves when they know they have no one to catch them if they fall. But the amount she had was not enough for land. Not on its own. "There might be another way," Emmett said. She waited. "Thomas Caldwell," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "Caldwell Ranch, east of Larned. He's been looking to expand the road traffic through his land for a year. He's got a stretch of the South Trail that cuts 3 hours off the freight route, but nobody uses it because there's nothing on it, no water, no shelter, no place to stop." Emmett said it carefully, the way a man presents an idea he's been turning over for a while and is now finally ready to say out loud. "Amos knows him. Says he's been talking about wanting to build a way station of some kind. Someone to manage it." He paused. "Amos mentioned your name." Eleanor sat with this. "You're suggesting I go talk to a rancher I've never met about building a kitchen on his land," she said. "I'm suggesting Caldwell might have land and the desire for exactly what you already know how to do," Emmett said. "And that what happened today, all those people, the way they came, is something you could walk into that conversation with." She thought about the notebook. 223 names, and more now after today. People who had come back. People who had come for the first time. A retired county judge who had ridden from Larne to be here. A freighter who had become, without any formal arrangement, her communications network. "Tell Amos to set up a meeting," she said. Emmett nodded. He picked up his hat from the table and turned it once more. In his hands, not the tell this time, but something that looked more like a conclusion. "You know something," Eleanor said. "What's that?" "You rode a lot of miles this month. For a woman, you've only known a few months, in a shed on a ranch where you work." She looked at him. "It's not nothing." Emmett looked at the table, then at the stove, then at her. "No," he said. "It isn't." He said nothing else. In the economy of Emmett Hayes, that was a considerable amount. He left at 6, and Eleanor was alone again with the stove and the notebook, and the low light of the January evening coming through the shed's single small window. She was tired in her bones in a way that was not entirely unpleasant, the tiredness of a day that had been used fully and well. Pulled the notebook off the shelf and opened it to the first page. James's handwriting on the very first recipe, his mother's apple cake, which he dictated to her on a Sunday afternoon in 1875, when she'd been trying to get it right and couldn't. His handwriting was slanted and particular, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write past childhood and had developed his own quirks in the process. She hadn't looked at that page in a long time. She ran one finger along the edge of the writing without touching it. Then she turned to the last entry, a woman named Rose, who had come through that very morning, passing through on the way north, who had sat at Eleanor's table for 20 minutes and eaten a bowl of oatmeal and left a recipe for pepper bread that she said her mother had brought from Germany and which had been feeding people for 40 years. Eleanor looked at the distance between those two entries. From James's handwriting in 1875 to Rose's pepper bread in January, 1,885. A decade. 240-something names. Every variety of hunger and hardship and movement and hope that the frontier produced, passing through a series of kitchens and ending up, all of them, in a worn notebook held together with twine. Closed the notebook. She was 44 years old. She was a widow. She had no land, no husband, no children, no institutional standing, and roughly 1 year of savings in a tin box under her cot. She also had Emmett Hayes writing when she asked. She had Clara Denby writing letters. She had Robert Harmon coming back from Hutchinson when it mattered. She had Amos Pratt, who knew everyone on the freight roads between here and Wichita. She had a retired county judge who had insisted on being brought along and who had stood in this yard today and made Gerald Holt understand the difference between a public nuisance and a community institution. She had 240 names, and every one of them was a person who had sat at her table and found something worth remembering. Dale Pruitt was not done. She knew that. He was somewhere right now, regrouping, finding the next angle, channeling the particular energy of a man who has been publicly corrected and who does not know what to do with that experience, except point it outward. But Dale Pruitt had been trying to reduce her for months. He had sent her to a shed, and she had built a kitchen. He had sent investors to buy her out, and she had refused them. He had filed a county complaint, and 240 people had shown up in a yard in January to tell the truth about what she had built. She was not afraid of what came next. She was, if anything, curious about it in the strange way she had noticed herself becoming curious about difficult things over the past months, the way you become curious about a thing you've discovered you're capable of surviving. She put the notebook back on the shelf and went to bank the fire for the night. Tomorrow she would cook breakfast. Emmett would come before dawn. Clara would write letters. Amos would carry word along the freight roads. And somewhere east of Larned, a rancher named Thomas Caldwell had a stretch of South Trail that nobody used because there was nothing on it. No water, no shelter, no place to stop. Eleanor Whitaker thought she might have something to say about that. The meeting with Thomas Caldwell happened on a Thursday, 11 days after the Saturday gathering, in the kind of cold that makes every breath visible and every decision feel more serious than it might otherwise. Amos Pratt drove her. They left Black River at first light in Amos's freight wagon, which was not built for comfort but was built for reliability, and Eleanor sat beside him on the bench, with her coat buttoned to the throat and the notebook in her bag, and the particular internal stillness she had learned to cultivate when she was heading toward something that mattered and could not afford to arrive at it already depleted by anxiety. Amos talked for the first hour, the way he always did, easy, unhurried conversation about the road and the weather, and the people he'd seen that week, none of it requiring much response. All of it serving the function of filling the cold air with something human. Eleanor appreciated this about him. He understood that some people needed noise to feel accompanied, and some people needed quiet, and he had calibrated himself to her without being asked. Caldwell's a straight talker, Amos said, somewhere around the second hour. He won't waste your time, and he won't expect you to waste his. Tell him what you've got and what you need. He'll tell you yes or no. What's your read on him? Eleanor said. Amos thought about it. Fair man. Not always easy, but his wife died 3 years back. He runs the ranch himself now, him and his son, and the son's more interested in cattle than in the trail side of things. He paused. He's been trying to get that south route developed for a long time. It's a good route, better than the main road in summer, safer in the wet season. But nobody will commit to it without a reason to stop, and without a stopping point, nobody commits to it. He glanced at her. You're the reason to stop. He hasn't met me yet. He's heard enough, Amos said. I told him about January. About all those people in the yard. Eleanor looked at the road ahead. The Kansas plains in January were not beautiful exactly, but they had a quality she had always found clarifying the absence of things that could distract you from the essential shape of the landscape, which was vast and flat and indifferent, and demanded that you be honest about what you were and what you wanted, because there was nothing out here to hide behind. What if he wants something I can't give, she said. What? Control, terms. Something that changes what the kitchen is in exchange for the land. Amos was quiet for a moment. Then you say no, he said. And we come home. She nodded. The Caldwell Ranch was larger than she'd expected, not the largest spread she'd seen, but substantial, with a main house that had been built to last and modified several times over, patchwork of additions that told the story of a growing operation across 2 decades. The yard was clean and functional. The horses in the near pasture were in good condition. These were the things Eleanor noticed when she arrived somewhere new, not because she was judging, but because they told her something about the people who lived there. Thomas Caldwell came out of the main house before they'd fully stopped. He was perhaps 55, with the build of a man who had done physical work his whole life and had not entirely stopped doing it, and a face that was weathered in the specific way of outdoor life, not rough, but lived in. He shook Amos's hand and then turned to Eleanor and shook hers with the same directness, not adjusting his grip because she was a woman. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "come inside." The office he took her to was a working space papers, maps, a desk that was used rather than displayed. He did not offer her tea. He offered her coffee, which she accepted, and he poured it himself from a pot on the small stove in the corner and sat across from her and said, "Tell me about the notebook." It was not what she had expected him to open with, and she told him so. "Amos told me about the gathering in January," Caldwell said, "about the people who came. He told me about the county complaint and Holt's letter. But the thing he kept coming back to was the notebook." He held his coffee cup in both hands. He said it was the thing that made it real. "So tell me about it," Eleanor told him. She had told the story before in pieces to different people for different purposes. To Holt, she had told the practical version, what the notebook documented, and why it mattered legally. Clara Denby, she had explained its strategic value. Emmett, in the earliest days, she had barely explained it at all, because he had been there to see it develop. She told Caldwell the whole version. The boy with the summer shirt, which was where it all began. The Tennessee man with his mother's corn chowder recipe. Martha Harmon's sweet potato pudding. Agnes Birch, who had written "I Don't Know What I Am Now, but Tonight I Was Warm." She told him about the retired judge, about the freighter's wife in Larned, about Clem the 19-year-old who was still trying to figure out what kind of man he was going to be. Caldwell listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment looking at his coffee. "My wife used to say," he said slowly, "that the worst thing about the frontier wasn't the weather or the distance or the work. It was the loneliness." He said it in the careful way that men say things about their wives when the wives are no longer there. Not being alone, plenty of people are alone and manage fine. The feeling that nobody knows you're here, that you could disappear and the world wouldn't register it. He looked at Eleanor. "Your notebook registers people." "Yes," she said. "That's it, exactly." He nodded, set his cup down. "I've got a parcel on the South Trail. 3 acres with a well that runs good in all seasons. There's a structure on it, used to be a line shack. Hasn't been used in 8 years. It's in rough shape." "I'm familiar with rough shape," Eleanor said. Something moved in his expression. "I've no doubt." He looked at the window, then back at her. "I'm not interested in owning a business. I'm not interested in a percentage of revenue or management rights or any of the arrangements that would put me in the position of your employer." He said it plainly. "What I'm interested in is that trail being used. If people are stopping on my land, not just your kitchen, but the trail of itself becoming a route people choose, that's worth more to me than any percentage of meals served. You'd give me the 3 acres lease, long term. Nominal cost. $1 a year if we're being formal about it, because a lease with no payment has no legal standing." He met her eyes. "What you build on it is yours. What happens in the kitchen is yours. I don't come in and make decisions about who you feed or how you run it. That's not my business." He paused. "My business is the trail." Eleanor sat with this for a long moment. She was looking for the catch not because she assumed there was one, but because she had learned, over a difficult few months, that terms that sounded clean in a first conversation had a way of developing complications in a second. "And if you sell the ranch," she said. He reached into the desk drawer and took out a folded paper. "I had my lawyer draft something last week, when Amos told me you were coming." He unfolded it and set it across the desk. "The lease runs with the land. If I sell, the terms transfer. You can't be removed without 12 months' notice and compensation for any structures you've built." He tapped the paper. "Read it. Take it to someone you trust. Don't sign anything today. Take it home and think." Eleanor looked at the paper. Then she looked at Thomas Caldwell across his desk. "You did this before you met me," she said. "Amos vouched for you." He shrugged, and in the shrug was the pragmatic ease of a man who trusts his information sources and makes decisions accordingly. And the story spoke for itself. She folded the paper and put it in her bag next to the notebook. She would take it to Beaumont, the retired judge, who had said to come to him if she needed a legal eye. She would read it herself 3 times first. "There's one more thing," Caldwell said. and in the slight shift of his register, she heard a different quality, something more deliberate, as though this was the thing he had been building toward, and was now arriving at carefully. Dale Pruitt, Eleanor waited. I know him, Caldwell said. Not well, but I know who he is. He was with a ranch in Reno County before Black River. There was a situation there with a foreman he pushed out. He looked at her steadily. It wasn't the first time, and it wasn't the last. I'm not telling you this to alarm you. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that the county complaint was not an isolated decision from a man who had a disagreement with his employer. It was a method he uses, has used more than once. Caldwell folded his hands on the desk. He's going to come at you again. Maybe not through the county, that door is closed now, with Holt's letter. But he has connections in Wichita, people who owe him favors, and he's the kind of man who keeps track of what he's owed. Eleanor thought about Beaumont's words. Men like that don't lose gracefully. What would you suggest, she said. Move fast, Caldwell said. Sign the lease, take your time with the reading, but sign it within the month. Start building. Every day you spend on that land with tools in your hand is a day the situation becomes more real, more documented, harder to dislodge. He looked at her. Dale Pruitt is good at attacking things that are still forming. He's less effective against things that are already standing. Eleanor rode back to Black River in the late afternoon with the lease papers in her bag, and Amos talking about the South Trail and what it could become. She sat on the wagon bench and looked at the winter plains, and felt something she was almost reluctant to name, because naming it made it available to be taken away. Hope was too soft a word for it. It was more structural than hope, more like the feeling of a foundation under your feet, after you've been standing on uncertain ground for a long time. The feeling of something that might actually hold, told Emmett that evening. He sat at the table and listened to everything she said about Caldwell and the lease and the 3 acres and the line shack and the $1 a year. And when she was done, he was quiet for a while in his usual way. You trust him, he said. I think so. I'm taking the papers to Beaumont. Good. He turned his hat in his hand, stopped, looked at her directly. What happens to the shed? To Black River? Eleanor had been thinking about this on the ride home. Keep running it until the new place is ready. There's no reason to stop. Holt's position is clear now, and the people who come here don't have anywhere else to go in the meantime. She paused. When the new kitchen is ready, people will follow. They follow the door that's open, not the building. Emmett nodded slowly. Then I'd like to help with the building. Caldwell land. He said it without decoration. If you want the help. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight of the shed that had been her home for 3 months, the patched roof and the clean stove and the notebook on its shelf and the 4 mismatched chairs and the 2 of them sitting in it at the end of a January day that had changed the shape of things. I want the help, she said. Dale Pruitt made his next move in February. It was not what Eleanor had expected, not another legal filing, not another approach to Holt. It was smaller and in some ways more insidious than either of those things. He began talking. In Wichita, in the stockyards, at the ranch owner meetings that happened quarterly in the county seat, he talked about Eleanor Whitaker with the careful, plausible-sounding language of a man who is destroying a reputation while being able to claim at every step that he was merely expressing concerns. He questioned her character, not explicitly, nothing that could be directly quoted and refuted, because Dale's was too intelligent for that. He raised questions about a widow woman running an unlicensed establishment, about the kinds of people she let in at all hours, about whether Gerald Holt had fully understood what he was permitting on his property. He said these things in the hearing of people who would pass them along, changed slightly. To other people, in the way that reputational damage spreads not like a fire but like water, finding every crack. Eleanor found out from Clara Denby, who had heard it at a ranch wives' gathering in late February, and who came to the shed with the specific energy of a woman who has received bad news and has already decided what to do about it. He's careful, Clara said. I'll give him that. Nothing actionable. Just drip, drip, drip. How much damage? Eleanor said. Some. Not as much as he's hoping, I think. Because enough people have heard the other story, the true one, that the questions don't land as hard as they would have in October. Clara looked at her. But it's not nothing. There are people who'll wonder. Eleanor sat with this. The thing about reputational attacks, she had seen them work before, had seen them work specifically on women who had no male authority to shelter behind, was that they didn't need to be believed entirely. They only needed to create enough uncertainty that people kept a slight distance, just in case. A slight distance was enough to shrink the room. A slightly smaller room was a slightly less real thing. and a slightly less real thing was easier to dismiss. Dale understood this. He had always understood people in that particular mechanical way, not with warmth or empathy, but with an accurate sense of leverage points. I need to answer it, Eleanor said. Not directly, Clara said immediately. If you respond directly, you're in a conversation with him on his terms. You become the woman defending herself against an accusation, which means the accusation has already done some of its work. Then how? Clara leaned forward. You build, you sign the lease. You break ground on the Caldwell land. You let the answer be a thing that exists, not a thing that argues. She met Eleanor's eyes. Let what you're building speak for itself. It's been doing that since October. Eleanor took the papers to Beaumont in the first week of March. He read them at his kitchen table over 2 cups of coffee and a period of silence that Eleanor used to eat the excellent cornbread his housekeeper had left on the table. Clean, he said finally. Unusually clean, actually. The transfer clause is solid. The compensation terms in case of sale are reasonable. He set the papers down. Sign it, you're sure. No lawyer is ever sure, he said. But I've read a great many contracts in my time, and this one says what it means. Caldwell's a man who knows how to write an agreement that reflects his actual intention. He looked at her over his coffee cup, which tells you something about his actual intention. She signed the lease on a Thursday afternoon in Caldwell's office, with Amos as witness and Beaumont's written approval in her bag. Caldwell shook her hand after, and she noticed that he held it a moment longer than the formal gesture required, not inappropriately, just with the particular gravity of a man who understands what he's putting his name on. Come see this land Saturday, he said. Bring whoever you want to bring. She brought Emmett. They rode out on Saturday morning, and Caldwell met them at the parcel boundary and walked them across the 3 acres in the cold March light. The land was good flat, with the well in the center of the parcel and the old line shack on the south side, close to the trail. The shack was in worse condition than even she had anticipated. 2 walls partially collapsed and the roof mostly gone. Emmett assessed with a slow walk around and an expression she had learned to read as serious consideration rather than discouragement. The foundation's solid, Emmett said, crouching to look at the base of the south wall. And the well. That's the 2 things that cost the most to put right, and they're already right. He stood. The rest is lumber and work. You've done this before, Caldwell said. He was watching Emmett with the appraising look of a man evaluating competence. Some, Emmett said. He rebuilt my shed from worse than this, Eleanor said. Caldwell looked between them, said nothing. But a small thing moved in his expression, the recognition of a dynamic that he was not going to comment on, but had clearly noted. They broke ground, or rather, began clearing and assessing in the 2nd week of March. Emmett came on his days off from Black River. Robert Harmon rode down from Hutchinson twice, with a friend who knew timber framing. Clara Denby sent her husband Henry, who turned out to be considerably more useful than his quiet disposition suggested. Amos spread the word along the freight roads with his characteristic efficiency, and 2 men appeared one morning whom Eleanor had never seen before, who said they'd heard she was building something, and that they were fair carpenters, and they'd work for meals. She fed them. They worked. The central fireplace went up first. This was Eleanor's one structural demand, the thing she had decided on before the first stone was laid. A large hearth, centered in the main room, wide enough to cook on and visible from the doorway. She wanted it to be the first thing you saw when you came in. Not because it was decorative, but because a fire in a hearth is the oldest possible signal that there is warmth here, that someone has prepared for your arrival, that you are expected even if nobody knew you were coming. Caldwell came by twice during the building. He brought his son the second time, a young man of perhaps 25, who said little and observed much, and who Eleanor sensed was trying to determine what exactly his father had committed the family land to. On the second visit, when they were standing outside looking at the walls, going up real walls now, with a proper roof in progress, Caldwell stood beside Eleanor and said, not quite casually, Pruitt's still talking. I know, she said, it's losing momentum. He said it as a statement of fact, not a reassurance. People have short memories for accusations when they can see a thing being built. Eleanor looked at the walls. He's not wrong about everything, she said. Caldwell glanced at her. He said I was doing something unauthorized, she said. He was right about that. I was at the beginning. He said the shed created complications for Holt. That was true too. She paused. He's a man who was working from accurate information and drawing the wrong conclusions from it. She looked at Caldwell. I don't find it useful to pretend otherwise. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. Most people in your position would prefer a simpler story. Hero and villain easier to tell. It is easier to tell, she agreed. But it's not what happened. He looked at her with the expression she had begun to recognize from him. Not admiration exactly, but a kind of steady assessment that felt more like respect than admiration, because it didn't require her to be impressive. It only required her to be honest. Dale Pruitt came to the Caldwell land once. It was in late March, on a day when Emmett and Robert Harmon and the two carpenters were working on the roof, and Eleanor was inside, managing the fireplace installation. She heard horses outside and came to the doorway, and saw Dale Pruitt sitting on his horse at the edge of the cleared property with the road behind him. He looked at the building. He looked at the workers on the roof. He looked at Eleanor in the doorway. She looked back. They had not spoken since the January gathering, had barely been in the same physical space. He looked different, somehow not diminished. That wasn't quite it, but tightened, as though something had condensed in him over the winter months, drawn inward and compressed. He did not dismount. He did not come closer. He simply looked at what was being built, and Eleanor stood in the doorway and let him look, because she had nothing to hide and nothing to defend against, and nowhere else she would rather be. After perhaps 2 minutes, turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Emmett, on the roof, had been watching. He said nothing. Eleanor went back to the fireplace. She thought about Dale that evening longer than she expected to. Not with anger, she had noticed, over the months, that the anger had been gradually replaced by something more complicated and less comfortable, which was a kind of understanding. Dale Pruitt was not a mystery to her anymore. He was a man who had built his entire life on a particular kind of authority. And when that authority was challenged, he had done what that kind of man does. He had used every tool available to reassert it. He had not succeeded, and the failure had cost him standing with his employer and credibility in the county and the clear-eyed judgment of everyone who had been in that January yard. Whether any of that would change him, she didn't know. Probably not, or not quickly. People don't generally change from losing, in Eleanor's experience. They change, if they change at all, from understanding what the loss revealed about them. And that kind of understanding requires a willingness to look at yourself honestly that not everyone has, and that cannot be forced from the outside. She hoped he would get there eventually. She was not holding her breath. What she had decided, somewhere in the long internal accounting of the winter, was that the energy she had spent being afraid of Dale Pruitt was better spent building something he could not reach. That was not forgiveness. Exactly, forgiveness was a word she was suspicious of when it came too easily. Its real forgiveness was a process that took longer than a winter and required the other party to have at least some awareness of what they had done. It was more like resolution, the decision to put a thing down because carrying it was costing her more than it was costing him. Put it down. Dale Pruitt left Black River Ranch in April. Holt told Eleanor himself, coming to the shed one morning in the second week of April, with the slightly uncomfortable directness of a man delivering information he's not sure how to frame. He resigned, Holt said. I want to be clear, I didn't push him out. I corrected him in January and I held to that, but I didn't dismiss him. I know, Eleanor said. You told me you wouldn't. He said the ranch had changed. Holt looked out the shed window at the yard he had owned for 20 years. I suppose it has. Eleanor poured him coffee and set it on the table, and they sat for a while without talking, which was a thing she had not imagined being possible with Gerald Holt in October, but which felt, now, simply like two people who had been through something together and were marking the end of it. What will you do with the main kitchen? She said. Hire a cook, he said. Probably Warren from the bunkhouse. He's not you, but he's competent. He paused. I want to keep the shed going if you're willing, even after you're established on the Caldwell land. She thought about this. Someone else would need to run it. Yes, Clem, she said. She surprised herself with it, hadn't planned it. It just arrived. Fully formed. He's 19, and he's trying to figure out what kind of man he is. Give him the shed. Give him the responsibility of it. He'll rise to it. She looked at Holt. Or he won't, and he'll learn something from that too. Holt looked at her. You trust him with what you built here? He's been here almost every day for 3 months, she said. He knows how it works. He knows what it is. She picked up her coffee. He just needs someone to tell him. It's his. The open hearth house, which was what Amos started calling it in his freight road conversations, and which stuck without anyone officially deciding it would, the way names stick when their right opened in the 3rd week of May. There was no ceremony. Eleanor was not a ceremony person, and Caldwell had made clear he wasn't interested in making a production of it. The door opened on a Tuesday morning. The fireplace was lit. Eleanor put oatmeal on and biscuits in. and the first 3 people who came through were a family of settlers heading west who had heard from someone on the road that there was a good stopping place on the South Trail. They sat at her table and ate, and left a recipe for blackberry jam in the notebook. The notebook had a new cover leather, stitched by Agnes Birch, who had turned out not to be permanently gone after all. She had written to Eleanor in March from her cousin's house in Missouri, and Eleanor had written back, and in April Agnes had arrived on a freight wagon with her repaired hands and the information that her cousin had been glad enough to see her, but that the house was crowded and the arrangement was not going to work long term, and that she had been thinking, on the road, about the shed and about the entry she had written in the notebook, and about whether there might be room somewhere for a woman who didn't have much left, but who still had her hands and some years in her. Eleanor had given her the room above the kitchen. It was not a large room. It had a small window and a narrow bed and a hook on the wall for a coat, and enough space just barely for the small trunk Agnes traveled with. Agnes had looked at it for a long moment standing in the doorway and then said, "It'll do," with the particular restraint of someone who means considerably more than that. She helped with the sewing and the mending and the minor repairs that a building always needs, and she ate at the table, and she did not write anything else in the notebook, but she read the new entries. Sometimes in the evenings, sitting near the fire with her repaired hands in her lap, and Eleanor watched her and understood that what Agnes Birch had needed was not a large thing, just a place where her presence was factored in. Emmett came to the open hearth house most days. He was still at Black River. He had his work there, his obligations, and Eleanor had never asked him to change that because it wasn't hers to ask. The South Trail was not far, and a man who rides for reasons can usually find time to ride, and Emmett Hayes had always been good at finding time for the things that mattered to him without making a declaration about it. They talked, in those visits, about things both practical and otherwise, the building's needs, the trail traffic, the people who had passed through, the state of the notebook. Sometimes they talked about other things, about what James had been like, which Eleanor found she could speak of now without the conversation turning into a wound. About Emmett's family in Missouri, his younger brother who Wes Alderman had gone to school with, the particular path that had brought him to Kansas and to Black River, and to her shed door before 5 in the morning. One evening in July, when the Kansas heat had settled full over the plains and the open hearth house was cooling slowly from the day's service, and Agnes was upstairs and the fireplace was down to coals, Emmett sat at the long table. It was a proper table now, 8 feet of solid oak that Robert Harmon had helped build in March, and said, without particular preamble, "I've been thinking about leaving Black River." Eleanor looked at him. "There's enough work here," he said. "Trail's picking up. You need someone who can handle the physical maintenance of the place, which is going to be more than you and Agnes can manage alone." He said it carefully, without looking at her, the way he said things that mattered to him. "It wouldn't be, I'm not suggesting anything that isn't strictly practical." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Emmett." He looked at her. "You rode to 6 counties in January in the cold to find people for me," she said. "You built this fireplace. You patched my roof in December at night by lamplight. Come here almost every day since May." She held his eyes. "There is nothing strictly practical about any of that." He was very still. "I'm not a young woman," she said. It was the same thing Dale Pruitt had said to her in October, and she had thought about that since the way the same fact could be wielded as a weapon, or stated plainly as a truth. She was stating it plainly. "I'm 44 years old, and I've been alone for 5 years, and I'm not interested in pretending that either of those things is not true." "Neither am I," Emmett said. "Then we understand each other." "Yes," he said, "I think we do." He came to the open hearth house in September. He left Black River on a Friday afternoon, and arrived on Saturday morning with his horse and his tools and his single bag of personal effects, and he took the room across from Agnes's that Eleanor had cleared out in August, which was a larger room with 2 windows and a view of the trail. Thomas Caldwell came by the following week. He stood in the yard and looked at the building, the real building now, with its stone fireplace visible through the wide doorway, and the smoke rising from the chimney, and the bench outside, where 2 travelers were eating lunch, and he stood with his hands in his pockets, and said nothing for a long time. "Something," he said finally. "It is," Eleanor agreed. He looked at her. "How's the trail traffic?" "Better every week. 3 freighters committed to the south route in August. 2 more last week." She paused. "Amos says by next spring the main road will start losing traffic to us. People talk. They do." He looked at the building again. There was something in his expression that she had seen before, in Robert Harmon's face, over his 3rd plate of venison. in Martha's face when she wrote in the notebook, in Agnes the first time she sat near the fire in the room that had been factored in for her. The expression of a person encountering a thing they had not known, they were hoping for, until they found it. My wife would have liked this, he said. Tell me about her sometime, Eleanor said. I'll put her in the book. He looked at her quickly, with the expression of someone who has been offered something unexpected and is not yet sure how to hold it. Then he nodded. Once, the boy came back in October. Eleanor was at the fireplace when she heard Emmett's voice outside, and then a different voice, younger. Not a man yet, but nearly, and she came to the doorway and saw him. He was 13 now, or close to it. He had grown, which was what 13-year-olds do, but the growth had not yet caught up with the rest of him. He was still too thin, too watchful, with the particular careful quality of a child who has learned to read situations quickly because his circumstances had required it. He was wearing a proper coat this time, which was the first thing Eleanor noticed, and good boots. He stood in the yard with Emmett behind him and looked at the building, and then at Eleanor in the doorway, and something in his face when he saw her was simultaneously the expression of the boy from October, and something entirely new, the beginning of the person he was becoming. You moved, he said. I did, she said. You found me anyway. He came inside. She sat him at the table and fed him, because that was still the first and most important thing. And Agnes came downstairs and looked at him with the perceptive attention of a woman who had seen a great deal of the world and recognized something in the shape of a person's history. He ate. And while he ate, Eleanor sat across from him and waited, because she had learned that people tell you what they need to tell you when they're ready, and pressing them only makes the telling harder. My name's Daniel, he said, when he was most of the way through his bowl. Eleanor, she said. He nodded as though confirming something he already suspected. I heard about this place on the road. People said there was a woman on the South Trail who fed people and didn't ask questions. He looked at his bowl. I remembered you from before. I remembered you too, she said. He looked up. You gave me bread, he said, when you didn't have to. And then I heard later, someone told me you got into trouble for it. Some trouble, Eleanor agreed. It worked out. It looked like more than some. He said it with the directness of a child who has not yet fully learned to soften things, and Eleanor found she appreciated it. I felt bad about that for a long time, he paused. That's why I came. He stopped. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I wanted to come. Eleanor looked at him across the table. 13 years old, alone on the road, carrying something he'd been carrying for a year because he had a conscience that wouldn't let him put it down. You don't owe me anything, she said. I made that choice before I knew your name. I know. He looked at the fireplace, at the fire, at the wide doorway behind Eleanor with the trail visible beyond it. This is bigger than a shed. It grew, she said, because of what you did that morning. She considered this. Because of a lot of things, she said. People who showed up. People who stayed. People who came back when they could have done otherwise. She looked at him. You're doing it now. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn at the folds, slightly damp from travel, and set it on the table. My grandmother's recipe, he said, for corn pudding. I've been carrying it since August. He looked at her steadily, with that watchful quality that had made her open the door in the first place. Can I put it in the book? Eleanor got the notebook from its shelf, the new leather cover that Agnes had made. She opened it to the last written page and set it in front of him with a pencil. He wrote carefully, in the handwriting of a boy who has taught himself to write and is still working at it, the recipe, then his name Daniel, then below it, the date and the location, and one more line that he wrote slowly and then looked at for a moment before leaving it. She opened the door when she didn't have to. Everything after that was because of that. Eleanor read it when he handed the notebook back. She read it standing at the fireplace, with the October afternoon light coming through the wide doorway and the fire behind her, and the notebook in her hands. She had thought, in October of last year, that she was making a 4-second decision about a hungry child. She had not known, could not have known, standing in that doorway, that the decision would cost her a kitchen and give her something larger, that it would pull 200 people into a yard in January and put her name on a lease and put Emmett Hayes in the room across from Agsburg Church with his tools and his hat and his quiet, persistent presence, that it would result in a building on the South Trail with a stone fireplace and a wide doorway and a notebook full of names that kept growing. That is the thing about the doors you choose to open. You don't get to know, in the moment, where they lead. You only get to decide whether the person on the other side deserves to have them opened. The rest unfolds from that, in ways you couldn't have planned and wouldn't have predicted, and what unfolds is your life. Or the best version of it, the version where you find out what you are actually made of when the situation stops being comfortable and requires something real. Eleanor Whitaker had been made of more than she knew. Most people are. They just don't find out unless someone or something, or some cold October morning with a hungry child on the other side of a door, creates the circumstances that require them to discover it. Closed the notebook. She put it back on its shelf. Daniel was still at the table, finishing the last of his bread. Agnes was at the far end of the room, doing what Agnes did, repairing something, attending to something, present without imposing. Emmett came in from outside with wood for the evening fire and set it near the hearth and looked at Eleanor with the particular look he had, the one that said he had registered what was in her face and was not going to comment on it, but wanted her to know that he had seen it. She looked back at him. She let herself be seen. Outside the South Trail was carrying freight wagons and settlers and travelers of every description, and the October light was doing what October light does in Kansas, clear and sharp and honest, lighting everything without glamour, showing the land as it is. On the trail, people were talking the way they always talk, passing information between themselves in the practical way of people who understand that information is a form of survival. There's a place on the South Route. A woman runs it. Good food and a fire, and she won't turn you away. Come if you're hungry. Come if you're cold. Come if you just need a minute to stop. And remember that someone knows you're here. The door is open. It has always been open. That is the whole story and the only story, and it is enough.